Welcome back to another story on Eclipse Wizardry. This time, we're bringing you, Pansy Parkinson found Harry with the Dursleys age 7 and ancient Slytherin magic declared him her lord. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Girl in the Garden. The summer Pansy Parkinson was 7 years old. Her mother dragged her to Surrey on what she described as a social obligation of the most tedious variety, which Pansy had learned to translate as old friends her mother no longer particularly liked but couldn't afford to offend. The house they were visiting belonged to a woman named Margaret Pennington, who had 3 cats, a husband who worked in insurance, and the peculiar distinction of being one of the few Muggle-borns Narcissa Parkinson had ever genuinely respected before the woman had chosen, in her mother's words, to entirely abandon the world she was born into. Margaret's daughter was away at university. Her husband was at work. The visit was, therefore, 2 women sitting in an over-decorated parlor drinking Earl Grey and being perfectly civil at each other while Pansy was pointed firmly toward the back garden and told not to get dirty. Pansy sat on the garden steps for approximately 4 minutes before the boredom became intolerable. The Pennington garden backed onto a wooden fence, and beyond the fence was an alley, and beyond the alley were the backs of the houses on Privet Drive. She wasn't supposed to go past the fence. She went past the fence. The alley was unremarkable, the kind of narrow, concrete nothing space that exists between suburban streets, lined with wheelie bins and the occasional forgotten bicycle. Pansy walked it with her hands in the pockets of her dress, which was pale green and entirely too nice for alley walking, and she was just beginning to consider turning back when she heard the sound. It was small. Almost nothing. A sharp, quickly suppressed intake of breath, the kind of sound a person made when they were trying very hard not to make any sound at all. She stopped. The garden behind number 4 Privet Drive had a low wooden gate, and through the slats she could see a boy sitting against the back wall of the house. He was small, smaller than her, she thought, though he looked about her age, with dark hair that went in every possible direction at once and glasses held together at the bridge with what appeared to be a piece of tape. He was wearing a t-shirt that was so large it hung off one shoulder, and shorts that were several sizes too big, cinched at the waist with what looked like a piece of rope. He had a bruise along his left forearm that was yellowed at the edges, old, and another one on his jaw that was newer and darker. He was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, absolutely still, staring at nothing. Pansy had been raised to notice things. Her mother considered it a point of family pride that Parkinsons observed before they spoke, thought before they acted, and never, under any circumstances, revealed surprise. So she didn't make a sound. She just looked at the boy through the fence slats, and she catalogued what she saw, and something in her chest did something strange and uncomfortable that she didn't have a name for yet. The boy hadn't noticed her. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance, the way eyes got when a person was trying to be somewhere else in their own head. "What are you doing?" she said. He startled badly, she could see it, the way his whole body went tense, the way his head came up and his eyes went sharp and wary in an instant, scanning for threat. It wasn't the startle of a boy surprised by a stranger. It was the startle of someone who'd learned that unexpected things were usually bad. He found her through the fence slats and stared. "Nothing," he said. His voice was careful. Neutral in that deliberate way that wasn't natural neutrality at all. "You're sitting against the wall of your house doing nothing?" "Yes." "Why are you outside?" A pause. Then, with the particular flatness of someone stating a fact they'd stopped feeling much about, "I'm locked out." Pansy looked at him. Then she looked at the house. Then she looked back at him. "Did you forget your key?" "I don't have a key." She turned this over. "Then how do you normally get back in?" "When they let me in." She thought about that for a moment. The uncomfortable thing in her chest got worse. "Who's they?" "My aunt and uncle." He was looking at her with a kind of wary curiosity now, like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Who are you?" "Pansy Parkinson." "I'm visiting next door." She nodded in the general direction of the Pennington house. Who are you? Harry. He didn't offer a last name. She noted that. How long have you been out here? Another pause. He was doing calculations, she realized, not of time, but of how much to say, which parts were safe. Since this morning. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. She had no way to know if he'd had anything to eat or drink. Looking at him, at the sharpness of the angles of him, the two big clothes, the careful blankness of his face, she thought probably not. That's ridiculous, she said. He blinked. Sorry? That's a ridiculous way to treat someone. She said it the way her mother said things that were simply true, not with particular heat, just with certainty. You should have water, at least. It's very hot. Something flickered across his face. Not gratitude, he was too careful for gratitude, too accustomed to things being taken back. More like confusion. Like she'd said something in a language he almost spoke. I'm fine, he said. You don't look fine. You look like you've been sitting in the sun for 6 hours. He didn't answer that. He was studying her with those careful, assessing eyes, and she realized he was trying to figure out what she wanted. What the catch was. Pansy had known other children in her life, pure-blood children raised in political families who moved through the world as if every interaction were a transaction. Harry Potter, at 7 years old, already moved that way too, except his wariness wasn't polished ambition. It was something older and rawer than that. It was pure survival. I'm going to get you some water, she said. You don't need to, I know I don't need to. She looked at him through the slats. I'm going to anyway. She went back to the Pennington house, went to the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had never in her life been told she wasn't allowed somewhere, filled a glass with water and took a biscuit from the tin on the counter because she thought he probably hadn't eaten, and went back out to the alley and pushed the gate to his garden open and walked in. He was on his feet when she came back, which she hadn't expected. Standing very still against the wall with a look on his face she couldn't quite parse, not afraid, not angry, just braced. Ready for something to go wrong. She held out the water and the biscuit. He looked at them for a moment. Then he took them both with a quick, practiced movement, like someone accustomed to taking things fast before they were withdrawn, and drank the water in 3 long swallows. He didn't eat the biscuit immediately. He held it. Thank you, he said. It was genuine. Careful, but genuine. Pansy sat down on the step by the back door because she was not about to stand in the sun when there was perfectly good sitting available, and she looked at the garden with what her mother would have called her thinking face, which Pansy privately thought was just the face she wore when she was actually paying attention to something. Harry sat back down against the wall. He ate the biscuit with the particular focused attention of someone who was genuinely hungry but trying not to look it. What happened to your arm? She asked. He glanced at the bruise. Fell. And your jaw? Fell again. You fall a lot. He looked at her. There was something almost like humor in it, wry and dark, the kind of humor that wasn't really funny. Yeah, he said. I do. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, my mother says it's vulgar to lie to people you've only just met. It implies you think they're stupid. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, your mother sounds like a lot. She is. Pansy smoothed the skirt of her dress over her knees. You don't have to tell me. I'm just saying I know you're lying, and I don't think you're stupid, so if at any point you want to stop lying, I won't make it strange. Harry Potter looked at this girl with her too proper dress and her very direct eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, You're weird. Probably, she agreed. Are you always outside like this, or just today? Most days, in summer. With no food? They usually leave me something. Uncle Vernon was angry this morning. She thought about asking why. She decided not to. She'd pushed enough for now, and she could see him calculating what she was going to do with everything he'd let slip, and she thought if she pushed too hard he'd shut entirely. So she said, "What do you do out here all day?" Something in him eased, very slightly, at the subject change. "Think, mostly. Sometimes I watch the garden. There are a pair of robins nesting in the hedge." She looked at the hedge. Sure enough, there was movement, a flutter and the bright dart of a red breast. "I see them," she said. "Have they hatched yet?" 3 days ago. 5 of them." He said it with a quiet sort of pleasure. "The mother sits on the fence sometimes when I'm very still. She doesn't seem to mind me." She thought about a small boy who had learned to be so perfectly still that a wild bird came to the fence beside him, and the uncomfortable thing in her chest did something it had never done before. It didn't feel like pity. She'd been raised to consider pity a useless emotion, and anyway this boy with his steady eyes and his dark humor didn't invite pity. It was something else. Something more like recognition. She was still thinking about this when it happened. Later, when she was older, she would describe it as the sensation of something ancient and enormous turning over in its sleep, like some deep geological process, not explosive, not violent, but immense in the way that tectonic things were immense. A shifting. A recognition. The magic came from somewhere in her bloodline so deep it predated her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, dormant for generations in the Parkinson line, waiting with the patience of something that existed outside of ordinary time. Her mother had told her about it once, in the offhand way pureblood parents mentioned old magical obligations. "There is an old magic in our family, Pansy, a pledge made to the heir of Slytherin himself. If the magic ever recognizes the lord it was bound to serve, it will make itself known. It's only theoretical, of course. No one has seen a true heir in centuries. It was not theoretical. It woke up." Pansy didn't make a sound. She sat very still on the step, her spine straight, her hands flat on her knees, and she felt the magic in her blood, old and cool and precisely certain, turn and point toward the boy sitting against the wall like a compass finding north. "There," it said, with no drama whatsoever. "There is your lord." Harry hadn't moved. He was watching the hedge, the robins fluttering in the late afternoon heat. He hadn't felt anything, or if he had, he hadn't recognized it. She looked at him, small, underfed, bruised, wearing clothes 3 sizes too big, sitting in the garden of people who locked him out and apparently hit him and called it falling. Her lord. She thought about that for a moment with the calm, analytical part of her brain that her mother had spent years carefully developing. She could have doubted it. She could have decided the feeling was indigestion or imagination. But Pansy Parkinson had been raised to know that magic didn't lie, and the magic currently settled in her blood like a stone settling to the bottom of a clear lake was not ambiguous. It was the least ambiguous thing she had ever felt. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought about what her father would say. She thought about what the correct, political, careful thing to do was. Then she looked at the boy watching the robins, thin and quiet and absolutely alone, and she thought, no. Not this. He doesn't stay here another night. "Harry," she said. He looked at her. "Are you a wizard?" The effect was instantaneous. Every muscle in his body went rigid. His face went carefully, completely blank in a way she recognized as the very opposite of blankness. It was the look of someone fighting very hard to control their reaction. He stared at her for a full 3 seconds. "What?" he said. Very flat. "Are you a wizard?" She wasn't asking. She said it with the tone of someone confirming something they already know. "Because the magic in my family just woke up and pointed at you, and that only happens for one reason, so I'm asking." His eyes were doing something complicated. She watched him cycle through denial, suspicion, calculation, and land somewhere in the vicinity of stunned. What are you?" "A witch. My family is very old." She said it simply. We have a magical obligation to the heir of Slytherin. An ancient one. The magic just activated, which means, she looked at him steadily, you're the heir. He stared at her. I don't know what that means. It means, she said carefully, that according to magic older than either of us, you are my lord, and I am supposed to serve you. She paused. I'm going to do that by taking you somewhere that isn't this garden. Do you object? He blinked. You want to take me, where? My family's estate. In Wiltshire. She stood up and smoothed her dress. You can have a proper meal and a real room, and my mother is going to need to hear about this because the magic in her bloodline just woke up too, I'd imagine, so she'll want to discuss it, and then we'll figure out what to do about. She gestured at the house, at the garden, at all of it, this situation. Harry was on his feet now, staring at her. She watched him want to believe it and fight the wanting, because he'd learned, somewhere along the way, that wanting things got you nowhere good. You can't just take someone. Your mum won't just. My mother understands magical obligations. She looked at him steadily. She will not love it, to begin with. She'll get there. And in any case, something sharpened in her voice, something that was entirely her mother's daughter, the magic has spoken. That rather settles the argument before it starts. He was staring at her with those careful green eyes, and she could see him trying to work out the angle, the catch, what this cost, what she wanted. She let him look. She had nothing to hide. Why are you doing this? He said finally. I told you. The magic, that's why the magic is doing it. His voice was quiet and precise. Why are you doing it? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, simply, because you've been out here since this morning and you didn't have any water, and that is not how anyone should live, magic or no magic. Something shifted in his face. Just slightly. The tiniest fracture in the careful blankness. He looked away, at the hedge, at the robins, and she could see him breathing, very deliberately, the way people breathed when they were trying not to let something matter too much. Okay, he said. Quietly. Okay. She nodded. Come with me, then. We need to tell my mother. She led him back through the gate, down the alley, and into the Pennington garden. The back door was still open. She walked through it with Harry a step behind her, and into the parlor where her mother and Margaret Pennington were still having tea, and where Isolde Parkinson was in the middle of a sentence when her daughter walked in accompanied by a small boy in an oversized t-shirt, and stopped. Isolde Parkinson was a composed woman. She had the sort of face that had been trained by decades of pureblood society to reveal very little. But Pansy watched the exact moment the old magic moved in her mother too, the almost imperceptible stillioning, the way her mother's dark eyes focused on Harry Potter and stayed there with an intensity she usually reserved for significant political decisions. Pansy, her mother said. Very carefully. Mother, Pansy said. This is Harry. We need to speak privately. Margaret Pennington looked between them with the politely baffled expression of a Muggle who had learned, from years of being Cordelia Parkinson's friend, not to ask too many questions about the strangeness that sometimes surrounded magical families. I'll put the kettle on again, shall I? She said, and excused herself with admirable tact. Isolde Parkinson stood. She looked at Harry the way Pansy had looked at him through the fence slats, cataloguing, assessing, and Pansy watched her mother's professional composure flex and recalibrate as the ancient magic settled in the room like a change in air pressure. Tell me your full name, her mother said to Harry. Not unkindly. But with the directness of someone who needed accurate information. Harry looked at Pansy. Pansy gave him a small nod. Harry Potter, he said. Isolde closed her eyes for a precisely controlled 2 seconds. When she opened them, she said, of course. Then she looked at Pansy. You felt it. The moment I came near him. Yes. As did I, just now. Her mother turned to look at Harry again, and Pansy watched something that was a mixture of duty and respect and genuine, carefully controlled emotion move through her mother's face. "Mr. Potter," Isolde said. "I knew your parents, briefly. They were exceptional people." Harry went very still. "You did?" "Professionally and in passing. Lily Potter was remarkable." She paused. "I was told you went to live with her sister's family." "I assumed," she stopped. Her eyes moved over his two big clothes, the bruise on his jaw, and in a tone that was very controlled and very cold she said, "How long have you been living next door?" "All my life," Harry said. "I was brought there when I was 1. The temperature in the room didn't change, but something in Isolde Parkinson's stillness shifted into something that Pansy knew, from long experience, was fury being very carefully held in place. Her mother turned away from Harry and moved to the window and looked out at the garden for a moment. "The magical bond," Pansy said. "It activated." "Mother. It's clear." "I know what it is, Pansy." Her mother turned back. She looked at Harry with an expression that had resolved into something simpler and cleaner than all the calculation that had come before it. "Mr. Potter. My daughter is correct that you are welcome in our home. More than welcome, you have a right to it, according to magic my family has carried for 300 years. I won't pretend it's a simple situation, and there will need to be conversations with the ministry, and questions about your guardianship that are going to require careful handling." She paused. "But none of that happens tonight. Tonight you come home with us. You have a meal. You sleep in a proper bed. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." Harry looked at her. Then at Pansy. His voice, when it came, was very small and very controlled, and Pansy could see what it cost him to ask, "They'll notice I'm gone." "Yes," Isolde said. "I expect they will. I also expect," she picked up her wand from where it rested on the side table, and Pansy noted with satisfaction that her mother's expression had settled into something with a very sharp edge, "that when I have a conversation with your aunt and uncle, which I intend to have, they will find the subject of your disappearance considerably less important than they might otherwise have done." Harry stared. Something moved through his face, something young and unguarded and entirely unlike the careful boy he'd been 5 minutes ago. "You do that?" "The ancient magic is not ceremonial, Mr. Potter," Isolde said. "It is binding. You are my family's lord. Which means, among other things," she said it with quiet precision, "that whatever has been happening in that house ends today." Pansy watched Harry absorb that. She watched him try to find the catch in it, the same way he'd looked for the catch in the glass of water. She watched him not find one. Isolde Parkinson went to speak to Harry's aunt. She was gone 11 minutes. When she came back, she said only, "We are leaving now," and her face was the kind of empty that meant the conversation had been extremely brief and entirely sufficient. Harry had nothing to take. That was the thing that struck Pansy as they went through the Pennington garden toward the street where Parkinson family's ministry-registered vehicle waited. He didn't go in to get clothes, or toys, or books, or any of the ordinary accumulated possessions of a child's life, because there was nothing to get. Everything he had was what he was wearing. He walked beside her in the afternoon sun, and she glanced at him, and he was looking straight ahead with those green eyes that didn't seem to miss anything, and she thought he looked like someone who was trying very hard to stay in the practical present and not think about everything the practical present implied. "What's Wiltshire like?" he asked, after a minute. "Quiet," she said. "Big. Green." She paused. "There's a library." A flicker. Something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "Books?" "Hundreds. Most of them are about magic." She glanced at him. "Can you read?" "Of course I can read." A pause. "They don't encourage it, but I figured out the school library early." "Good." She walked in step with him. "Then you won't be bored." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, like he was testing something, what does it mean? The bond. What does it mean you have to do? She thought about it. She could give him the political answer, the one about the Parkinson family's historical alignment with the true heir of Slytherin's house, the ancient obligation of service and counsel that went back to the founding of the Bloodline Pact. She could give him the magic's answer, loyal service and the protection of Lord's interests above family interests. But Harry Potter, she thought, had been given enough abstract obligations in his life by people who defined his purpose without asking what he wanted. So she said, "It means I'm on your side. Whatever that ends up meaning." She paused. "It means I tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient." Another pause. "And it means I'm not easily scared off." He looked at her. Something in his face was very young for a moment, stripped of the careful control. "Why aren't you afraid of this?" he said. "You found out about all of this, the bond, the magic, and you're just fine with it. You're 7. So are you," she said. "I have less reason to be scared. It's about me. The magic chose you," she said. "Slytherin magic that's been dormant for 3 centuries didn't suddenly wake up to choose someone unremarkable." She met his eyes. "That's not something to be afraid of. That's something to be interested in." She paused. "And anyway, I'm not fine with all of it. I'm furious about your garden situation. I'm just not showing it the same way." That almost smile again. Closer this time. "You're really weird," he said. But it sounded different than it had before. Less like an observation and more like the beginning of something. Pansy Parkinson looked at the boy who was, according to magic, older than both of their families' written histories, her lord, thin and bruised and carrying absolutely nothing, walking away from the worst thing that had ever been done to him without looking back, and she felt the ancient bond settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock. "Get in the car, Harry," she said. He got in the car. Isolde sat in the front with the Parkinson family's discreet driver, a quiet man named Aldous who had been with the family for 20 years and who, Pansy noted, simply glanced once at Harry in the rearview mirror and said absolutely nothing, because Aldous was excellent at his job. Pansy sat in the back with Harry. The car moved through the clean suburban streets of Little Whinging, past the well-kept lawns and the ordinary houses and the absolutely ordinary horror that had been conducted behind one set of ordinary walls, and Harry looked out the window as it all slid past and away. "My aunt will tell people I ran away," he said. "Not a question. She'll tell people whatever my mother told her to tell people," Isolde said, without turning around. Which was something to the effect of an unfortunate personal crisis requiring Harry's immediate relocation to a family friend. With certain encouragements toward discretion. What kind of encouragements? Isolde paused a half-second. The kind that are persuasive. Pansy looked at Harry. He was quiet for a moment, processing that, and she watched the corner of his mouth do something that was, unmistakably, a smile, small and a little dark and entirely genuine. "Okay," he said. The city gave way to motorway, and the motorway gave way to countryside, and the countryside opened up into the green rolling hills of Wiltshire, and Harry's face pressed almost imperceptibly toward the window as the world outside got wider and greener and emptier and more like something that might contain space for a person to simply be, and Pansy watched him watch the world go by. The manor appeared at the end of a long drive lined with old oaks, their branches meeting overhead in a vault of green. It was not, by Pureblood standards, an enormous estate. Malfoy Manor made it look modest, but it was old and well-kept and imposing in the particular way of houses that knew what they were, and the moment the car passed through the wrought iron gates, Pansy felt the wards recognize her and welcome her home. She watched Harry watch the house approach. He said nothing. He had gone very still again, but this time it wasn't the stillness of someone preparing to absorb a blow. It was something different, the stillness of someone witnessing something they don't have immediate words for. "Home," Pansy said simply, as the car stopped. He looked at her. And then, for the first time since she'd found him through the fence slats, Harry Potter looked not careful, not calculating, not braced for something to go wrong. He just looked like a boy of 7 who had been sitting in a garden alone all day and was suddenly, incomprehensibly, in a place that might be something other than that. "Yeah," he said. Very quietly. "Okay." The house opened its doors for them. The wards, Pansy noted with satisfaction, responded to Harry the same way they responded to family, with a kind of settled, attentive recognition, the magic of the house reaching out toward him the way the bond magic had reached through her. The manor knew what he was. It always knew what it knew. Pansy walked up the front steps beside him, not leading, not pulling, just walking at the same pace, and the door closed behind them both, and number 4 Privet Drive was, for Harry Potter, permanently and irrevocably finished. Above them, in the rafters of the old manor, a barn owl shifted on its perch and watched the boy with the lightning bolt scar step into his new life with exactly as much drama as that sort of thing deserved, which was none, and which was everything. Chapter 2. What the Manor Knows. Harry woke up in a bed so large he'd rolled over twice in the night looking for the edge and not found it. He lay still for a moment with the unfamiliar ceiling above him, pale plaster with a decorative border of leaves that had been painted there so long ago the paint had softened into the plaster itself, and did what he always did when he woke somewhere new. He catalogued. He listened. He checked whether there was something he needed to be ready for. The room was quiet. Not the tight, listening quiet of the cupboard, where silence meant he was waiting for footsteps. This was different. This was the quiet of a house that had no particular interest in him beyond the settled acknowledgement of his presence. No one was coming. Nothing was wrong. The light coming through the curtains was the soft gold of early morning, and somewhere outside there were birds doing the kind of relaxed, purposeless singing that birds did when nothing was hunting them. He stayed there for another full minute just listening to the birds. The room was, not his, exactly, but offered to him without condition. Dark wood furniture that was old enough to have gone past antique into simply solid. A wardrobe that was actually a wardrobe rather than a thing he lived inside. A window seat with cushions. Bookshelves with a modest collection already on them, which he'd noticed last night and had spent approximately 30 seconds deciding not to investigate immediately, because he'd been so tired that his bones felt liquid and Pansy had told him very firmly to sleep. There were clothes on the chair by the bed. He stared at them for a moment. They were folded neatly, trousers and a shirt that appeared, at a glance, to be his size. He had no idea how this had happened. He got up and examined them and they were plain and well-made and entirely the right size, and he thought about the fact that someone had cared enough to find clothes his size before he'd even woken up, and he put the thought down carefully because thinking about it too hard did something uncomfortable to his chest. He dressed. He found the bathroom, which was across the hall and had a mirror that said good morning, quite rested, I think in a conversational tone that startled him badly until he realized it was just being helpful. He washed his face. He looked at himself in the mirror, green eyes, messy hair, the bruise on his jaw yellowing at the edges, and the mirror said, without being asked, the Master Sweet Parkinson uses didn't on bruises. Second cabinet on the left. Harry opened the second cabinet and found a small pot of didn't salve and applied it carefully, and watched the bruise fade to almost nothing in 40 seconds, and stood there for a moment longer than was probably necessary. Then he went to find the library. The house was easier to navigate than he'd expected. Not because it was simple, it wasn't, it had 3 floors and more rooms than he'd been able to count from the tour Pansy had given him last night, delivered in the tone of someone who'd memorized the manor the way other children memorized multiplication tables, but because the house itself seemed inclined to help him. Twice he paused at a junction uncertain of direction, and both times something shifted, a shaft of morning light falling at an angle that drew the eye, a door that was slightly more open than the others, and he followed it, and it was right. The library was on the ground floor in the east wing, 2 large rooms connected by a wide archway, the walls entirely shelved except for the windows and a fireplace that was laid but unlit. The books went floor to ceiling. There was a rolling ladder. Harry stopped in the doorway and looked at it all and felt something in him that wasn't quite happiness but was in that general direction, a kind of deep, steadying rightness. "I thought you'd come here first," Pansy said. He turned. She was sitting in a chair by the unlit fireplace with a book already open in her lap, wearing what he was coming to understand was her habitual at-home expression, sharp, observant, tolerantly amused. She was wearing a dark blue dressing gown over her clothes and her dark hair was loose, and she looked entirely comfortable and like someone who had been waiting without impatience. "You could have just told me where it was last night," he said. "I did tell you where it was last night. You were half asleep." She closed her book with a finger marking her place. "How did you sleep?" "Fine." He paused. "Good, actually." He looked at the shelves. "Are all of these about magic?" "Most. The far room has general history and some fiction. The front room is mostly magical theory, family records, and practical reference. Those," she pointed to a section cordoned off with what appeared to be a simple velvet rope, "are my mother's private collection. She'll need to approve before you touch those, but she probably will." Harry walked to the nearest shelf and read spines. History of Wizarding Britain. Magical Bloodlines and Inheritance. The Properties of Ancient Binding Magic. A Comprehensive Guide to Slytherin's Legacy, Volumes I through 4. He pulled Volume I out, looked at it, put it back. He'd have time. He had, he realized, with a peculiar vertiginous quality, what appeared to be quite a lot of time. "Sit down," Pansy said. "Aldous will bring breakfast up in a few minutes. My mother wants to speak with us this morning." He sat in the opposite chair. It was deep and comfortable in the way of chairs that had been sat in for generations. "What does she want to speak about?" "Everything," Pansy said, with the tone of someone who had been raised to consider everything a manageable scope. "The bond. What it means practically. What to do about your situation legally. What happens next. What does happen next?" She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "That's partly up to you." He considered that. In his experience, things happening next were not partly up to him. They were up to other people, Uncle Vernon's moods, Aunt Petunia's schedules, Dudley's whims. The idea of next being a thing with room in it for what he wanted was genuinely novel. "I want to learn magic," he said. It came out more straightforwardly than he'd intended. "Obviously," she said. "What else?" He thought. "I want to know why I'm what I am. What the bond means. What all of it means." He paused. "And I want to understand why they were afraid of me." She went still. "The Dursleys? They've always been afraid of me," he said. It wasn't complaint. It was observation, precise and calm. I could feel it underneath everything else. Vernon especially. He was angry, mostly, but it was sitting on top of something scared. He looked at the bookshelves. "Whatever I am, whatever made that magic activate when you came near me, they knew something about it. They always knew I was different and it frightened them." He paused. "I want to understand why." Pansy looked at him for a long moment. "My mother's private collection," she said. "Most of what she has on the Slytherin bloodline and its heir is in there. Then I want access to her private collection. I'll ask." "Thank you." Aldous arrived with breakfast on a tray, proper breakfast, the kind Harry had watched Dudley consume every morning of his life from the other side of the kitchen, eggs and toast and juice and fruit, and set it on the low table between them with the quiet efficiency of a man who found the situation entirely unremarkable. He said good morning to Harry with the same tone he'd have used with anyone, and left. Harry ate with more restraint than he wanted to, because he'd learned that eating too fast made people notice, and he didn't want. He stopped the thought. Looked at the food. Looked at the room. He was not in a place where eating too fast would cause problems. That was a rule from a different world. He ate quickly because he was hungry and because it was good and because he could. Pansy ate with the precise, unhurried manners of someone raised to treat meals as social occasions, and didn't comment on his speed, and he found he liked that about her. Isolde Parkinson came in at 8:30, dressed with the kind of understated precision that Pansy clearly inherited from her, and carrying a leather folio that looked old enough to have opinions. She sat in the high-backed chair near the window and looked at them both. "Good morning, Mr. Potter." "Harry," he said. "Please." She paused, then inclined her head. "Harry. Did you sleep?" "Yes." "Good." She opened the folio. "I want to explain some things, and then I want you to ask me whatever you like, because I think you are the kind of person who will have questions and who will be better served by getting answers than by being managed." She looked at him steadily. "I'm right about that, aren't I?" "Yes," he said. "Then we understand each other." She set the folio on her knee. "The magical bond that activated yesterday is called the Fidelis Dominus Pact. In plain terms, it is a blood pledge made by the Parkinson family approximately 3 centuries ago to the direct magical heir of Salazar Slytherin, not the political inheritor, not the self-proclaimed heir, but the true bloodline descendant. The pledge binds the family in service and loyalty. It has never activated in the time my family has been alive. Until yesterday." Harry listened. He was very good at listening. He'd learned that being quiet and still meant people sometimes said things they hadn't intended to say, and that information, in his experience, was the most reliably useful thing you could have. "The magic recognizes you specifically," Isolde continued. "Not your name, not your fame. You were 1 year old when the most significant public event of your life occurred, and I doubt the old magic cares about newspaper headlines. It recognizes your bloodline. Your mother's line." She paused. Lily Potter née Evans is, a more complex genealogy than it appeared. The Evans family were considered Muggle-born. But Muggle-born is not always what it seems. Sometimes it is a magical line that went dormant generations back and surfaced again unexpectedly. She opened the folio to a page of careful genealogical notation. "The investigation I did last night, using the Parkinson family's bloodline records, suggests that your mother's line connects, through several generations of dormancy, to Slytherin's own descent." The room was quiet except for the birds outside. "She didn't know," Harry said. "Almost certainly not. The line had been dormant long enough that it wouldn't have registered in any standard blood test. It would have looked like an ordinary Muggle-born gift." Isolde looked at him. "What it means practically is that you are not merely a famous boy, Harry. You are the legal and magical heir to one of the 4 Hogwarts founders. With everything that implies." "Which is what, exactly?" She smiled, briefly. It was Pansy's smile in an older face, precise and a little sharp. "We'll come to the specifics. But in immediate terms, you have vaults at Gringotts that you haven't been informed of. You have a legal status in the wizarding world that your guardians had no right to suppress. You have a claim to the Hogwarts legacy that is not ceremonial." She paused. "And you have, as of yesterday, the Parkinson family's complete loyalty, resources, and counsel at your disposal." Harry thought about that. He thought about it the way he'd gotten into the habit of thinking about things, carefully, from multiple angles, looking for what it cost and who wanted what from it. Old habit. "What do you get from this?" he asked. Isolde looked at him, and something in her expression shifted into something he thought was genuine respect. "The magic is binding. We don't get a choice. The magic doesn't choose whether you help me or just host me politely and do the minimum. That's a choice." A pause. Then Pansy said, from her chair, "I told you he was like this." Isolde looked at her daughter and back at Harry. "You're right," she said. "The magic binds our loyalty. How that loyalty is expressed is our choice. And our choice is to be genuinely useful to you, because," she paused, and something crossed her face that was not political or calculated, "because I knew your parents, and I knew what was done to you, and the magic obligates me but the anger is my own." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "Then, the Dursleys. What happens to them? What would you like to happen to them?" The question sat in the air. He thought about Vernon's hands and Petunia's cold eyes and the cupboard under the stairs that he had lived in until he was 7 years old. He thought about the bruise on his jaw that had already faded and the ones on his arm that would take another week. He thought about the carefully locked pantry and the specific mathematics of watching Dudley have what he needed and knowing you were not Dudley. He didn't feel the heat of fury about it. The fury was there, but it was underneath something cooler and more practical, because he'd grown up in a house where showing the heat got you punished for it. "Nothing dramatic," he said. I don't want revenge. I want them to not be able to pretend it didn't happen. And I want to make sure they can never be given another child to look after." He paused. "Is there a way to do that?" Isolde was quiet for a moment. "There are ministry officials who handle child welfare cases in the wizarding community. If a formal report were filed, and I am prepared to file one with considerable supporting documentation, the Dursleys would be placed under a monitoring restriction. They would not be eligible for any form of guardianship in either the Muggle or wizarding systems." She paused. "They would also be legally required to relinquish all claim to you, which as your former guardians they nominally still hold. We would need to petition for that, and it will require a court hearing." "How long?" "Several months, likely. In the meantime, your presence here is covered under an emergency welfare relocation, which I filed this morning." Her voice was matter-of-fact but her eyes weren't. "You're not going back, Harry. That much is settled regardless of the court timeline." He breathed. He'd known it, had felt it in his bones since the car ride, but having it said plainly and directly was different. Something in him that had been on a very low continuous hum of anxiety quieted slightly. "What about Dumbledore?" he asked. Both Parkinsons looked at him. "He's the one who placed me with the Dursleys," Harry said. "He'd worked this out partly last night and partly this morning, from the logic of it. Someone had decided where he went after his parents died. That person was, by any reasonable assessment, the most powerful figure in wizarding Britain. He'll have opinions about me being here." Isolde set down the folio. "He will." "Yes. And, she said, that will be a conversation that happens on our terms, not his. He placed you in that house. Whatever his reasons, and I expect they were considered and deliberate, the results speak for themselves." Something flattened in her voice. "He is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot and the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation. He is not above accountability." "He'll say it was for my protection," Harry said. "Whatever magic my mother did when she died, I read about it, at school. The kind of sacrifice magic, the protective kind. He'll say the blood wards required family. He'll have a reason that's technically true and uses real things." The room was quiet for a moment. "Where did you read about sacrifice magic?" Pansy asked. Curious, not accusatory. "My primary school had a library with a section on folklore and mythology. A lot of it turns out to be actual magical history written for Muggles. I read most of it in year 1. He shrugged. "I had a lot of time." Pansy looked at her mother. Her mother looked at Pansy. Something passed between them that Harry filed away for later examination. "He may have a technical reason," Isolde said finally. "That doesn't mean his reason is complete, or that the method he chose was the only option, or that you were not owed better than what you received." She closed the folio. "We will deal with Dumbledore when he makes contact. He will make contact, probably soon, now that you've moved." She met Harry's eyes. "When he does, let me speak first." "No," Harry said. Politely but absolutely. "I'll speak for myself. You can be there, and I'd prefer that you were. But I'll speak for myself." Another pause. And then Isolde Parkinson nodded, and it was not the nod of someone humoring a child. "All right," she said. After she left them with the folio and instructions to read the relevant sections of the Slytherin inheritance documentation, Pansy stood and went to the shelved section with the velvet rope and unclipped it. "She said yes this morning when I asked," she said, by way of explanation. Harry came and stood beside her, and together they looked at the collection. There were perhaps 60 volumes, these ones older than the others, the leather worn soft, the spines faded, the titles in a script that was older than modern English. Pansy pulled out 2 volumes with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where things were. "These first," she said. "Then these." She indicated 4 more. "The others are advanced enough that my mother wants to explain context before you read them cold." He took the first 2 and went back to his chair. She went back to hers. They read in silence, which was comfortable in a way that silence with Pansy had already established itself as being, and the house sat around them in the morning light, and outside the Wiltshire countryside went about its ordinary green business. He had been reading for perhaps 2 hours when Pansy said, without looking up from her own book, "You did magic last night." He looked up. "What?" "When you got in the car. You were looking out the window and," she glanced at him, "the lights on Privet Drive. One of them flickered when we went past." "Not mechanically. The same way the lights flickered in the Pennington garden when I told you about the bond." He thought back. "I didn't do that on purpose." "I know. Accidental magic." She looked at him with the expression of someone making a considered observation. "It happens more with you than normal. I've been keeping track." At his look, she said, "Since yesterday, I mean." "In the car, when you first came inside here, the fire in the downstairs hall lit itself when you walked past it. The house responded to you before the wards had even formally registered your presence." He considered this. "Is that unusual?" "Very." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Accidental magic in children usually requires strong emotion, fear, anger, distress. It doesn't just happen because you walk past a fireplace." She paused. "Whatever you are, Harry, the magic in you is active. Even when you're not doing anything." He looked at his hands. They looked like ordinary hands. He thought about the garden at Privet Drive, about the times things had happened that he'd never been able to explain, that had gotten him in trouble because Vernon had seen and been frightened by it. The time he'd somehow gotten onto the school roof. The time he'd changed the color of a teacher's wig. He'd always thought of it as accidental, uncontrolled, something that happened to him rather than something he did. He wondered, for the first time, whether that framing was entirely accurate. "Show me something," Pansy said. He looked at her. "I don't know how." "Then figure it out." She picked up her book again. "Don't aim for anything I'll miss. Try the candles." The candles on the mantelpiece were unlit. He looked at them. He thought about, he wasn't sure what to think about. He tried to reach for the thing he'd felt yesterday when the bond activated, that vast cool sense of recognition, something in him that was larger than the ordinary boundaries of himself. He thought about the fire in the hallway, the lamp on the road, the way the house had settled around him like a welcome. Nothing happened for 30 seconds. Then one candle lit. Not with a flicker. It simply had a flame where it hadn't had one before, as if the idea of fire had always been present and he'd simply given it permission to manifest. Pansy looked up. Looked at the candle. Looked at him. She said. "That's all you've got?" I'm cataloging." She looked back at the candle. "You didn't struggle. You just decided." She tilted her head. "Most untrained children can't produce deliberate magic at all. They can't separate will from emotion sufficiently. You just separated them." He looked at the candle. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she wasn't wrong. He'd removed the emotion from it entirely. He'd treated it like a problem. A thing to understand and then direct. Light the others, she said. He lit the others. All 5 of them, evenly, one after another. Pansy made a note in the margin of her book. He didn't ask what the note said. He thought, with a kind of private satisfaction, that he'd find out eventually. The day settled into a comfortable rhythm, reading, a noon meal in the dining room where Isolde asked him measured questions about his schooling and listened to his answers with genuine attention, then more reading, then a walk in the grounds because Pansy said fresh air was non-negotiable and she said it in exactly her mother's tone. The estate grounds were old and well-tended, rolling down from the back of the manor to a stream that marked the property line, with a kitchen garden and a stand of old oaks that threw good shade. Harry walked in it with his hands in his pockets and his face in the sun and said nothing for a long time, and Pansy walked beside him and was quiet too, and it was fine. It was fine in a way that made the back of his throat ache slightly, the way things did when they were good in a context where you'd learned not to expect good things. He recognized the ache. He decided to simply let it be there rather than push it down. The wizarding world, he said eventually. What's it actually like? Political, she said. Historical to the point of occasionally being absurd. Stratified, pureblood families at the top, half-bloods in the middle, Muggleborns at the bottom in the opinion of some, none of which is rationally defensible but is nonetheless thoroughly embedded. She paused. Magical in ways that are genuinely astonishing, if you can get past the politics long enough to appreciate them. Where do I fit in it? She glanced at him. You're famous. Voldemort, she said the name without the flinch he'd come to associate with it from other people, and he noted that, killed your parents and tried to kill you when you were 1 year old and failed. The reason he failed is, my mother's sacrifice, Harry said. I know that part. Right. Well. The reason you're famous is that he was, until that point, effectively unstoppable. He'd had 15 years of building power and killing people who got in his way and no one had been able to so much as slow him down. And then a 1-year-old stopped him. From the perspective of people who'd spent over a decade living in genuine terror, that was, she searched for the word. A miracle, Harry said. A symbol, she said. Which is both more useful and more complicated than a miracle. She stopped by the stream and looked at the water running over the stones. You've been famous your entire life and you've never known it. You've been called the boy who lived in wizarding newspapers since you were 13 months old. Harry looked at the stream. And now I'm 11 months from Hogwarts. September after next, she agreed. Yes. What happens when I get there and I'm not what they expect? She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean I grew up in a cupboard under the stairs and I've had 2 days of magical training and everyone else from wizarding families has been living in this their whole lives. What happens when I get there and it turns out I'm just, ordinary? That the bond was just an old magic that made a mistake? She stared at him for a moment with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read. Then she said, you lit 5 candles in sequence without instruction, training, or visible effort, at 7 years old, and the only reason we're not seeing more spontaneous magic is that you have naturally extraordinary control for someone your age. She paused. And the ancient Slytherin bond, which has never activated in 300 years of recorded family history, activated within 6 feet of you before I'd said 10 words to you. Another pause. Does that sound like a mistake to you? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. But I needed to ask. That's fair, she said. Ask whatever you need. I'll tell you when I don't know, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I won't tell you things just because they're comfortable to hear. She met his eyes. That's what I meant yesterday. About being on your side. He held her gaze. All right, he said. Then I want to start learning. Properly. Not just reading, I want to practice. My mother has a formal magical instruction program in mind. She'll want to manage it carefully, especially before you have a wand. Pansy paused. she'll likely reach out to some independent tutors. People who can teach magical theory and wand technique without involving Hogwarts until you're ready. But for now?" She smiled, and it was the first time he'd seen her smile properly, not the small, precise expression she used in conversation, but something genuine and slightly dangerous. "For now," she said, "I'll teach you what I know. Which is more than most 7-year-olds, because my mother started my education when I was 4. "Then let's start now," Harry said. "We're outside." "So?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the stream. "Fine," she said. "Try to move the water." He looked at the stream. He did what he'd done with the candles, stripped out the emotion, treated it as a problem, felt for the thing inside him that was larger and cooler than ordinary will. He thought about the water, the mass of it, the way it was already moving and what it would mean to redirect that movement rather than impose on it from nothing. The stream didn't change course. But a single arc of water lifted briefly from the surface, no higher than an inch, no longer than a moment, and fell back. Pansy breathed in. Very carefully. "Again," she said, and her voice had the quality of someone trying very hard to stay academic about something that was not, in fact, academic. He did it again. Higher this time. She stood beside him and watched the water move at 7-year-old Harry Potter's direction, and the afternoon light came through the oak canopy above them in long gold angles, and somewhere far above them in the house a barn owl was watching from the rafters, and the estate grounds sat in their quiet Wiltshire green, and everything that was coming, the letters, the vaults, the wand, the train, the school, the politics and the battles and the war that was already simply waiting for the right moment to resume, was still safely in the future where it had no power yet. And Harry Potter stood at the edge of a stream on the grounds of a house that had already decided he belonged there, and made the water rise, and looked at it with an expression that was not wonder exactly but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone recognizing something they'd always known about themselves finally given space to be true. He let the water fall back. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Pansy agreed. They stood there a moment longer, both of them looking at the stream. "You'll need books on wandless magical theory," she said. "Formal exercises. We should build a schedule." "Tomorrow," he said. "Why tomorrow?" He looked at the stream. "Because today I just want to do this." She considered that. Then she sat down on the bank with her dress tucked around her knees and opened the book she'd brought with her. She always had a book, he was already learning, and said, "Fine. Keep practicing. I'll read." So he practiced, and she read, and the afternoon went long and gold and unhurried, and that night at dinner Isolde told them that the ministry welfare filing had been acknowledged, that the Gringotts inquiry she'd initiated had received a preliminary response flagging significant inheritance matters requiring the account holder's attention, and that she'd had a letter from Dumbledore. She set the letter on the table between them. Harry looked at it. Then he looked at Isolde. "What does it say?" "It expresses deep concern about your welfare. It requests that you be returned to the care of your designated guardians. It explains that the arrangements made for your protection were carefully considered and are essential for your continued safety." Isolde's voice was very neutral. "It is a polite letter. It is also, between the lines, a letter from a very intelligent man who has just realized that something is moving outside the parameters of his plan." Harry thought about a man who had decided, carefully and deliberately, that a cupboard under the stairs was an acceptable price for whatever larger strategy he was running. He thought about that strategy, about what it required, about what kind of boy it needed him to be. "Write back," he said. "Tell him I'm well and safe and not returning to Privet Drive, and that I look forward to meeting him at his convenience." He paused. "Be polite. But be clear." Isolde's mouth curved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something with more edge than a smile. "Perfectly clear," she said, and picked up her quill. Pansy, across the table, caught his eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He could see it in the set of her expression, something that was satisfaction and recognition both, the look of someone watching a thing they already knew become visible to everyone else. The candles in the dining room were lit. He hadn't done it deliberately. Chapter 3, Vaults and Wands. The letter from Dumbledore came back within 2 days. Polite, measured, and containing within its careful sentences the particular quality of a man recalibrating. He expressed his understanding that Harry's current placement was a matter of some distress, and that he had the deepest respect for the Parkinson family's distinguished history, and that he would very much like to arrange a visit at Harry's earliest convenience to discuss certain matters of significant importance to the boy's future. He signed it with 3 of his titles and a note that the lemon drops he'd enclosed were his personal favorite. Harry read it twice at breakfast, eating toast with the unhurried attention of someone who no longer had to eat quickly, and then set it down. "He's not angry," he said. "No." Isolde was reviewing the Gringotts' correspondence across the table. "He's adapting. He'll want to see you in person before he commits to a position. Dumbledore doesn't make unnecessary moves in writing." "When should we meet him?" "After Gringotts," she said. "You need to know what you're walking into that conversation with." That settled it. The meeting with Gringotts was already scheduled for the following Thursday, 7 days away, 7 days which Harry used with a focus that seemed to mildly alarm Pansy's mother and impress her in equal measure. He read everything in the Slytherin section of the library that Isolde had cleared for him. He practiced the wandless exercises Pansy had outlined in the schedule she'd built with the methodical precision of someone who took educational planning personally. By Thursday morning he could reliably move small objects without touching them, sustain a lit flame for up to 3 minutes, and had twice, accidentally, done something to the physics of sound in the east sitting room that had caused Isolde to put down her work and look at him very carefully before saying nothing and going back to her papers. The morning they left for London was overcast, the kind of grey English summer day that felt more like September than July. Isolde dressed impeccably as always. Pansy wore dark robes over Muggle clothes with the ease of someone who moved between worlds without particularly favoring either. Harry wore the clothes that had been appearing in the wardrobe with quiet regularity, this time dark trousers and a green shirt that he was fairly sure hadn't been there yesterday and that fit exactly right, and he was beginning to understand that the house was doing this and had decided not to question it. They didn't take the Parkinson car to London. They fled. Harry had not fled before. Pansy told him this with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering a pre-flight safety briefing. "Stand up straight, don't lean, say the destination clearly, don't panic when it spins," and then stepped into the green flame herself and vanished with the nonchalance of someone stepping onto a bus. Harry looked at the fire. "Don't overthink it," Isolde said, from behind him. He stepped in and said Diagon Alley clearly, and the world became a roaring green tunnel of smoke and heat and impossible motion, and then he was stumbling out of a fireplace in the leaky cauldron into the dim warmth of a pub that smelled like centuries of spilled butterbeer and wood smoke. Pansy was already there, entirely undisgruntled, brushing a single fleck of ash from her sleeve. He straightened up and looked around. The pub was not busy at this hour, a few figures nursing early drinks, a witch reading a newspaper, a pair of old wizards playing chess in the corner with pieces that appeared to be having their own argument. No one looked at him. He was, he supposed, unremarkable here, just a boy in green with untidy hair, newly arrived, nothing to signal his significance. That wouldn't last. He knew it wouldn't last. He intended to be ready for when it didn't. Tom the barman waved at Isolde with the recognition of someone who knew a regular important customer when he saw one, and Isolde nodded back with the minimal acknowledgement of someone who kept their interactions exactly as long as they needed to be. She led them through the back and tapped the specific brick in the wall with her wand, and Harry watched Diagon Alley open up in front of him. He stopped. Not because it overwhelmed him, though it was overwhelming, certainly, in the way of things that were too busy and too colorful and too alive to take in all at once. He stopped because he could feel it. The magic in the air here was thick and layered, centuries of spellwork and enchantment built up like geological strata, and whatever was active in him moved toward it with the same instinctive recognition he'd felt the moment Pansy had sat beside him through the fence. Walk, Pansy said, from his left elbow. He walked. Diagon Alley on a Thursday morning was busy without being chaotic, shopkeepers laying out morning displays, a group of what looked like students on an early school supply run, an owl post delivery being sorted outside a small office. Harry looked at everything. He didn't gawp, he catalogued. He noted the categories of shops, the arrangement of the street, the way the alley bent and widened near Gringotts at the far end, where the white marble bank sat on its elevated position with the self-satisfied grandeur of an institution that had existed longer than any government currently operating and intended to continue doing so. Nobody recognized him. He had exactly one moment of tension when a witch coming out of the apothecary glanced at him with the beginnings of a double take, but Isolde had, at some point in the days prior, acquired a hat for him, a simple dark cap that sat low enough to cover the scar without looking deliberate about it, and the glance slid off him and moved on. The doors of Gringotts were enormous and staffed by goblins who were shorter than Harry and looked at him with the assessing disinterest of beings who had evaluated the financial worth of considerably more impressive individuals than 7-year-old wizards. Harry looked back at them with the same quality of attention, because he respected things that assessed honestly and didn't bother with performance. Inside, the marble hall was all columns and activity, goblins at high counters processing transactions, wizards waiting with the anxious patience of people handling money, the distant sound of carts running on rails far below. The scale of it was impressive in an institutional rather than decorative sense. It meant old and stable, and we have seen everything and are not moved by any of it. Isolde went to the nearest available goblin and said, "Isolde Parkinson. I have a confirmed appointment with account manager Griphook regarding the Potter estate. This is Mr. Harry Potter." The goblin, who had been writing something with a quill designed for hands larger than his, looked up. His eyes went to Harry with the same assessing quality as the door guards, but there was something additional in it. Something that rearranged. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Please follow me." They were taken not to the main counter but through a side door and down a corridor that was less grand than the main hall and considerably more businesslike. Stone walls, practical torchlight, doors with no labels that presumably labeled themselves in whatever system mattered here. The goblin led them to a meeting room with a low table, several chairs, and a second goblin already seated with an enormous leather-bound ledger in front of him. "I am Ragnarok," said the second goblin. He was older than the first, with the particular quality of stillness that came from decades of conducting important conversations in this room. "I am the senior account manager for the Potter estate. Please sit." They sat. Isolde to Harry's right, Pansy to his left. He noted the configuration with private appreciation, flanked, not protected. There was a difference. "Mr. Potter," Ragnarok said. "Before we proceed, I need to verify your identity in the standard manner for estate matters of this significance." He produced a small, very plain knife and a piece of parchment and placed them on the table. 3 drops of blood on the parchment will authenticate your bloodline against the estate records." Harry picked up the knife without hesitation and pricked his finger and let 3 drops fall. The parchment absorbed them and for a moment nothing happened, and then lines began to write themselves, first his name, then his parents, then a cascade of names behind theirs going back with increasing speed until the parchment was half full and still writing. Ragnarok looked at it. Something in his expression, which had been professionally neutral, became something else, not quite satisfaction, but the look of someone seeing a long-term account matter finally resolved correctly. "Potter, James Charles," he said. "Potter, Lily Minerva née Evans." And behind the Evans line, he read the parchment, as we had suspected since the preliminary inquiry. "The bloodline is confirmed. You are the authenticated heir of the Potter estate, the Evans ancillary estate, and," he paused very slightly, "the Slytherin foundational estate, held in trust by Gringotts in perpetuity pending heir identification." The room was quiet. "There are 3 separate vaults," Ragnarok continued, folding his hands on the ledger. "Vault 687 is your personal trust vault, established by your parents and accessible upon your 11th birthday under normal circumstances, though given the guardianship irregularities flagged by the Parkinson family's inquiry, we are prepared to grant supervised access immediately." He turned a page. Vault 1 is the primary Potter family vault. It contains the accumulated assets of the Potter family across 14 generations, including property deeds, heirlooms, financial instruments, and significant liquid funds. You will have full access upon your 17th birthday or, in the event of a formal wizarding emancipation. Another page. Vault 0 is the Slytherin Foundational Vault. It has not been accessed in 3 centuries. It will open for no one except the authenticated heir. Harry looked at the parchment. At the column of names cascading down it. His mother's handwriting would have looked nothing like this. This was goblin script, formal and angular, but he thought about the line of it, the way it ran back through generations of ordinary people who hadn't known what they carried, and down to her, who had been told she was simply a Muggle-born and had never been told the rest. He thought about what it meant that no one had told her. "The trust vault first," Isolde said. "And then we'd like to review the contents inventory for Vault 0, if you have one." "We have records going back to Slytherin's own deposits," Ragnarok said. "The vault is substantial. Something that might have been amusement in a face less professionally controlled. Shall we?" The cart ride was extraordinary. Harry sat beside Pansy with the rails shrieking and the torch-lit tunnels blurring past at speeds that should not have been comfortable and were somehow exhilarating, and Pansy held the side rail with an expression of practiced boredom that she hadn't quite fully achieved, because he could see the corner of her mouth pressing against a smile. He didn't bother hiding that he found it excellent. The trust vault was exactly what Ragnarok had described, modest by the scale of what was coming, but to a boy who had lived in a cupboard it was staggering. Gold coins in stacks that glittered orange in the torchlight. A chest with a note on it in his mother's writing that said for Harry, when he's old enough. "We're sorry we couldn't give it to him ourselves." He looked at the note for a moment and then put it down carefully on top of the chest, because he would open that when he was ready and this was not the right moment. He took a handful of galleons, more than he needed, less than he could have, because Isolde had told him a wand and school supplies were the immediate priority, and because taking more felt unnecessary when it was all accounted for and going nowhere. Vault 0 was further down. Further down than any vault they'd passed. The air changed as they descended, older, colder, carrying the particular quality of spaces that had been sealed for centuries. The dragon that guarded this level of the vaults ignored their cart, which their goblin guide said was because the vault itself had magical neutralizing properties that affected the Guardian's perceptions, which Harry filed away as interesting and examined later. The door of Vault 0 was not gold. It was stone, ancient stone, fitted with runes that Harry couldn't read yet but that he could feel the moment the cart stopped, the same way he'd felt Diagon Alley, the same way he'd felt the Parkinson Manor's wards. A deep, settled power that had been waiting with the patience of geology. Ragnarok stepped down from the cart and held one hand toward the vault. "We cannot open this," he said plainly. "We never could. The verification magic will identify you and either admit or reject you. We have simply maintained the outer chamber." Harry stepped off the cart. He walked to the stone door. He put his hand flat against the runes and felt them shift under his palm like something turning over in sleep, the same sensation Pansy had described the bond as being, enormous and unhurried and entirely certain. The door opened. Not dramatically. Not with light or sound or ancient mechanism grinding. It simply ceased to be closed, the way the candle flame had simply been there when he decided it should be. He stood in the entrance and looked at what 3 centuries of a founder's accumulated magical legacy looked like in the dark. Ragnarok, from behind him, said quietly, "We will wait here." He went in. Pansy, after a moment, followed. The vault was not what he'd expected from the word vault. It wasn't a room full of gold. It was more like an archive. Shelves and shelves of objects, books bound in leather and snakeskin, scrolls sealed with wax, instruments he had no names for yet, a collection of wands in individual cases, not new wands but old ones, very old, with the quality of things that had been significant and then carefully preserved. Cases of potions, ingredients organized by a system he couldn't immediately parse. A sword. A portrait, its subject apparently absent from the frame. And in the center of the room, on a stone plinth, a single object, a ring with a dark stone set in silver, the stone carved with a symbol he didn't recognize but that the magic in him recognized immediately, a deep pulse of acknowledgement like a word spoken in a language that predated words. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He turned around slowly and looked at all of it, and he thought, this was a person. A real person who built things and thought about what would be left and who set all of this aside for someone who wouldn't come for 300 years. Harry, Pansy said, quietly. He turned. She was standing near the shelves of books, looking at the spines, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it, not the composed directness she wore in conversation, not the clinical interest she wore when they were practicing, but something more open than that. These are his original notebooks, she said. Salazar Slytherin's own handwriting. He came to look. The notebooks were there, a dozen of them, the leather dark with age, organized on the shelf in what was presumably chronological order. He took the first one down and opened it to the middle and found handwriting that was cramped and precise and foreign in its lettering but entirely legible, and he could read it, which shouldn't have been possible since it was in a form of English that predated modern spelling by several centuries. He looked at the words and they made sense. He looked up at Pansy. "Can you read this?" She leaned in and looked and frowned. "No. The script is too archaic, I'd need a translation charm." He looked back at the notebook. He could read it the way he could feel the bond, not learned, not taught, just present. He understood, without being told, that this was the heir's inheritance expressing itself. He put the notebook down carefully and looked at the ring on the plinth. He felt Pansy go still behind him. "Not today," he said. The ring was significant in a way he couldn't fully articulate, not dangerous, exactly, but weighty. The kind of thing you picked up when you were ready for what came with it. Later. "All right," she said, without argument. They went back to the cart. Ragnarok had the vault's full inventory ready in the outer chamber, a document of 50 pages that Harry took and handed to Isolde, who examined the first 3 pages with an expression that managed to remain composed through what appeared to be considerable effort. They emerged from Gringotts into the overcast morning of Diagon Alley and stood on the steps for a moment. Harry looked at the street. "Wand next," Isolde said. Ollivander's was narrow and quiet and stacked to the ceiling with thin boxes, and the man behind the counter was white-haired and pale-eyed and looked at Harry the moment he came through the door with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific customer. "Mr. Potter," Ollivander said. And then he simply looked, for a long moment, with those extraordinary eyes that were the color of the moon. "Mr. Ollivander," Harry said. "I wondered when you'd come." He emerged from behind the counter, a thin old man moving with the careful precision of someone who found carelessness in his craft professionally offensive. "I heard rumors, of course. Vague ones." He looked at Harry's forehead, where the cap sat low, and said nothing about it. "Shall we?" The process took 40 minutes. Not because the right wand wasn't there, Harry could feel, from the moment he crossed the threshold, the particular quality of one box on the third shelf from the left that was different from the others, that had the same settled awareness as the vault door, as the Manor's wards, as Pansy's bond. But Ollivander was methodical and he was not going to be hurried, and so Harry tried 14 wands that did nothing much at all, and 2 wands that responded briefly and then subsided, and 1 wand that sent a shower of sparks toward the ceiling that made Ollivander cluck and retrieve it very quickly. Then Ollivander went to the third shelf from the left, and Harry didn't watch which box he took because he already knew, and when the old wand maker placed it on the counter and lifted the lid, Harry felt the recognition move through the room like a bell tone. The wand was 11 inches. Holly. With a core that Ollivander had not yet mentioned, but that Harry could feel before the wand maker told him, a warmth to it, something organic and alive. Phoenix feather, Ollivander said. A very particular phoenix. And yes. He was watching Harry with an intensity that was not alarmed but was something close to reverent. There is another wand, Mr. Potter. In my records. That wand shares a core from the same phoenix. The phoenix in question gave only 2 feathers. He paused. The other wand did great things. Terrible things, but great. He met Harry's eyes. You should know that. I know, Harry said. Can I hold it? Ollivander placed it in his palm. The wand did not shoot sparks. It did not send light ricocheting off the walls or produce a dramatic display of any kind. It warmed in his hand, steadily, like something settling into place, and every bit of magic in Harry, the active, present quality that Pansy had noticed and catalogued and been careful around, went still and focused. For the first time since he'd been in Pansy's garden, the constant low hum of his own power didn't feel like something sitting just outside the boundary of his control. It felt like it was home. He raised the wand. He thought of the stream in the Parkinson grounds, of the arc of water lifting. A perfect arc of golden light curved from the wand's tip to the ceiling and held for 3 seconds before dissolving. Ollivander exhaled. It was a small sound but significant. He looked at Harry with those pale eyes and said, very quietly, curious. Very curious. And considerably more than curious. He paused. Take care of it, Mr. Potter. I will, Harry said. He meant it. He was paying, galleons counted out with the practiced ease of someone who'd been handling money since he could reach a counter, which admittedly wasn't long, but he managed with dignity, when Pansy, who had been standing quietly to one side through the entire process, said, Mr. Ollivander. If you were a wand, what would you be? Ollivander looked at her with something that was almost a smile. 10.5 inches, ebony, dragon heartstring, he said immediately. Uncompromising. Loyal. Difficult for anyone who doesn't mean what they say. He tilted his head. Shall we find out? The wand that found Pansy was 11.5 inches, he'd been slightly off on the length, she pointed this out, English oak and dragon heartstring, which produced a neat, controlled shower of silver sparks and then went very still and cooperative in her hand. The process took 9 minutes. She was not surprised by this. She was the kind of person whose wand knew what it was getting into. They came out into the alley with wands in their pockets and the day somewhat more real than it had been. It was early afternoon now, the cloud cover breaking up. The alley was busier than it had been. Isolde was reviewing a small notepad, school supplies, Harry assumed, the list she'd been building in anticipation of Hogwarts 2 years out, which she'd apparently decided was not too early to begin sourcing. They were outside the apothecary when Harry felt it. Not a magical sensation. A social one. The particular shift in ambient noise and motion that meant people had noticed something. He didn't look up immediately, he catalogued the change first, mapping it. A witch coming out of flourish and blots who stopped and stared. 2 wizards near the robe shop who put their heads together. A child tugging a parent's sleeve and pointing. The cap. He'd taken it off in Ollivander's, easier to fit the wand when nothing was on his head, and hadn't put it back. He put it back now, but it was already too late. The woman from Flourish and Blots was approaching with the particular quality of motion that meant she had decided to do something, her face arranged in an expression of amazed delight. Excuse me, I'm so sorry, but are you Harry Potter? He looked at her. He was tired from the morning, and his head was full of vault inventories and the warmth of the wand in his pocket, and he thought briefly about denying it. Then he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be. Yes, he said. The effect was immediate and gratifying from an observational standpoint if not from any other. 3 more people turned. The child who'd been pointing let out a sound that was presumably excitement. The 2 wizards abandoned any pretense of subtlety and came directly over. He handled it. He discovered, a natural steadiness in the face of this kind of attention that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the same quality that let him separate emotion from will when he was practicing. He was polite. He was brief. He let Isolde intercept the more enthusiastic inquirers with the particular quality of "that will be enough, thank you" that she deployed like a precise instrument. And through all of it he kept his expression calm and his eyes clear and his hands loose at his sides, because he was not frightened of this and he was not overwhelmed by it, and if the wizarding world was going to look at him, they were going to see a boy who looked back. Pansy stood slightly behind his right shoulder throughout, not hiding, not interjecting, simply present, and he thought, that's what it looks like. That's the shape of it. Afterwards, walking away from the small crowd that Isolde had efficiently dispersed, Pansy said, "You handled that well." "I had nothing else to do with it," he said. "Most people would have panicked. Or performed." He shrugged. "Performing is exhausting and panicking's useless." He paused. "Though I think it'll get worse when I go to Hogwarts." "Significantly worse," she agreed. "But you won't be doing it alone." He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, watching where they were going, and she said it with the flat certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than offering comfort. He found he preferred that. "The Dumbledore meeting," he said. "Next week?" "Mother will write today," Pansy said. They caught up with Isolde outside the robe shop, where she was holding the door and examining her notepad with the expression of someone who had decided that the day had been sufficiently eventful but that there was still a list to get through. "Madame Malkin's first," she said. "Then the bookshop. Then we go home." He followed her in. The robe fitting was efficient. Madame Malkin had that quality of professional competence that was indifferent to the significance of who you were and simply cared whether the hem sat right. Pansy stood to one side and watched with critical attention and twice suggested adjustments that Madame Malkin, after a pause, accepted. Harry stood on the fitting block and watched himself in the mirror, the faint remnant of the jaw bruise, entirely gone now, his hair as impossible as always, the tape-repaired glasses that he was going to need to address at some point, wearing robes that fit him for the first time in his memory, and thought about the boy in the garden 2 weeks ago. The boy who'd been sitting against the wall with nothing, who'd taken a glass of water like someone expecting it to be taken back. He thought about the vaults. The notebooks in Slytherin's own hand. The wand warm in his pocket. Pansy making notes in the margin of her book. Isolde saying "You're not going back." He thought about the ring on the plinth that he hadn't picked up yet because he knew it would wait, because it had been waiting for 300 years and a few more weeks wouldn't trouble it. He stood straight on the fitting block and the robe's fit and the mirror said something complimentary that he didn't particularly need and he thought, not yet. Not even close to yet. But this is where it starts. Outside, buying books with more freedom than he'd ever had in a shop, he found a copy of Slytherin's Foundational Magical Theory, a published version, obviously, not the notebooks, but a scholarly reconstruction, and opened it and understood immediately that the reconstruction was wrong in 3 distinct places, because he'd seen the original handwriting and the translation had missed the nuance. He bought it anyway. He'd annotate it. Pansy, looking over his shoulder at his expression, said, "What?" "The translation's wrong," he said. She looked at the book. Back at him. "You read the notebooks for 20 minutes. The Old English came naturally." He shrugged. "It's a bloodline thing, I think." He looked at her steadily. "I'll need to write a corrected version eventually. The wrong translation has probably been the basis of a lot of other scholarship." She stared at him for a moment. Then she added 2 more books to the stack in her arms and said, "Your Hogwarts reading list is going to be longer than most people's." "Good," he said, and went to find more. They fled home from the Leaky Cauldron in the late afternoon, returning to the manor in the golden hour before dinner. Harry came out of the fireplace, brushed off the ash with more competence than the first time, and stood in the entrance hall of Parkinson Manor with shopping bags and a wand in his pocket and 3 months of intensive magical education still ahead of him before the Hogwarts letter came. The house recognized him, the same way it always did now. The warmth of the ward settling around him like a familiar thing. That night at dinner, Isolde told them she'd written to Dumbledore and proposed the following Tuesday. She also told them that she'd received a response from the Ministry Welfare Division confirming the guardianship investigation into the Dursleys had been formally opened and that Harry's relocation to the Parkinson household had been approved for the interim period. Harry ate his dinner and listened to both pieces of information with equal attention and filed them in the same part of his mind, the part that was building a picture, edge pieces first, of what the next several years were going to look like. He was beginning to see the shape of it. The edges were coming in. After dinner he went to the library and took down Volume I of the Slytherin inheritance documentation and turned to the chapter on the foundational estate, and read until the fire burned low, and when Pansy came in at 9 o'clock to tell him he should sleep before tomorrow's practice he looked up and said, "The ring in the vault. Do you know what it is?" She sat down in her chair. "A founder's ring. House ring. The formal insignia of the head of Slytherin's line." She paused. "When you put it on, you'll be formally, magically, and legally recognized as the Lord Slytherin in any wizarding court or institution that recognizes ancient bloodlines." A pause. "Which is most of them?" He thought about that. "When do you think I should do it?" She looked at him steadily. "When you're ready to have no one be able to pretend you're anything other than what you are." He nodded slowly. "Tuesday," he said. "After Dumbledore." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. He closed the book. Outside, the Wiltshire night was clear for the first time in weeks, and the stars were very bright over the manor's stone face, and somewhere below in the vault system of Gringotts a ring sat on its plinth in the dark and waited with the patience of very old things for the moment it had been waiting 3 centuries to arrive. Not long now. Chapter 4, The Sorting Tuesday arrived with the particular quality of days that had been building toward something. Harry woke early and lay in the large bed for exactly 2 minutes before getting up, because lying there thinking about it wasn't useful. He dressed, dark trousers, a deep green shirt that the house had decided was appropriate, and his wand in his pocket where it had been every day since Ollivander's, and went to the library where Pansy was already there, already reading, because Pansy's relationship with sleep appeared to be functional but not sentimental. "Nervous?" she said, without looking up. "No," he said. Then, because she'd told him from the start she'd know when he was lying, a little. "That's sensible. He's not someone to be careless around." She turned a page. "But you have more in that meeting than he'll expect you to have, and he knows it, which is why he agreed to come here rather than insisting you go to Hogwarts." That was true. The location had been Isolde's first move. The letter had specified the Parkinson estate, on the grounds that Harry was still a ward of the household in the interim period and his medical and emotional welfare required familiar surroundings. It was formally correct. It also meant Dumbledore was walking into their space, not his. Harry sat and read for an hour without properly taking anything in, which he recognized as unusual and slightly annoying, then put the book down and went to practice in the grounds instead. The wand work was different now. With the holly wand the distinction between intention and effect had collapsed almost entirely, the wand not so much translating his will as conducting it, the way a very good instrument made a musician better by simply being in tune with them. He spent an hour on the exercises Isolde's tutor had given him, a retired Hogwarts charms professor named Whitmore who came 3 mornings a week and who had spent the first session looking at Harry with the expression of someone revising several held assumptions, and by the end he was doing things Whitmore had said were technically third-year Hogwarts level, which Harry found less interesting than the ways those techniques could be modified if you understood the underlying theory rather than just the form. He was working on a modification of the standard Aguamenti form, thinking about what the spell was actually doing versus what it was conventionally taught to do, when Pansy appeared at the edge of the garden path. "He's here," she said. He nodded. He let the water working settle and pocketed his wand and walked back toward the house. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't delaying. He was simply moving at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and no anxiety about arriving. Isolde had put Dumbledore in the formal sitting room, which was the most deliberate architectural statement available in the manor: old portraits on the walls, significant family pieces, the particular weight of accumulated history. It was a room that said, we have been here a very long time and we know exactly what we are. Dumbledore was sitting in one of the chairs with the air of someone accustomed to sitting in significant rooms and being entirely comfortable in them regardless. He was exactly what Harry had constructed from the stories and the brief references and the 2 careful letters: old, enormously and visibly powerful, with that quality of warmth that some very intelligent people had, the warmth that was genuine and also instrumental, and that the most honest version of him would admit was both things simultaneously. His blue eyes found Harry the moment he came through the door, and Harry thought, he's been waiting to see what I am. Harry, Dumbledore said. His voice was what Harry had expected, warm, measured, with the specific cadence of someone who had spent decades making people feel that the conversation they were in was the most important one they'd have that day. I am so very glad to see you well, Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. He crossed the room and took the chair across from him, not the one Isolde had probably intended for him, the one slightly off to the side, but the chair directly opposite, because he wasn't going to have this conversation from an angle. Thank you for coming. Dumbledore's eyes, those famous, assessing eyes, did something brief and microscopic. Not surprise, exactly. Recalibration. Isolde took the chair to Harry's right. Pansy remained standing near the window, which she'd done deliberately and which Harry suspected Dumbledore had already filed under interesting. I must say, Dumbledore said, that Parkinson Manor is looking very fine. It has been some years since I visited. He looked at Isolde with the warmth of an old acquaintance. Your rose garden, Isolde, still exceptional. Thank you, Albus. Her voice was pleasant and perfectly empty of anything useful. He turned back to Harry. And how are you finding Wiltshire? Quite different from Surrey, I imagine. Yes, Harry said. He let the words sit without addition. He was not going to do the work of making this comfortable. Not yet. Not until he understood what Dumbledore actually wanted from the meeting rather than what the meeting was performing. The blue eyes did the thing again. He was being evaluated and they both knew it, and Harry thought it was probably more honest to be clear about that. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his tone shifted, just slightly, the performance of ease dialing back, something more genuine coming through. I want to begin by saying that I am truly sorry for the circumstances you lived in on Privet Drive. That was never, the intention was never for you to be unhappy. I want you to know that. I know the intention wasn't, Harry said. What was the actual plan? A pause. Very small. The blood wards, Dumbledore said. Your mother's sacrifice created a very powerful protective magic, tied to her blood. As long as you were in the home of her blood relatives, the protection held. It is, a very real protection, Harry. Voldemort's followers would have found you easily without it. Would have, Harry said. Past tense. I'm not there now. No, Dumbledore said. You're not. Which is why I'm concerned. And there it was, the careful, genuine adjacent concern that was also a direction. This is a problem. You should return. Harry looked at him steadily. The wards required me to be in my aunt's house. Did they require my aunt to lock me in a cupboard? Silence. Did they require her to not feed me regularly? Did they require my uncle to hit me? He said it without heat, which he knew made it more effective, not a child's complaint but a clear-eyed list of facts. Because if those things were also part of the protection, you should tell me, and I'll take it seriously. But if they weren't, he held the old wizard's gaze, then the blood wards and the abuse are 2 separate things, and talking about the blood wards doesn't address the abuse. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore was still, in the way of very powerful people who had just encountered something that required them to recalibrate more substantially than they'd planned. The warmth in his face hadn't left. Harry didn't think it was fake, exactly, but there was a layer of it that was very carefully being maintained. "You're right," Dumbledore said. "They are separate things. And what happened to you in that house was wrong. Entirely and without qualification." He paused. "I failed to monitor the situation as closely as I should have. That responsibility is mine." Harry nodded. He accepted the admission without making it into a larger moment, because making it larger served nothing. "Thank you," he said simply. "The question now," Dumbledore continued, and Harry noted the shift, the admission handled, moving on, my agenda resuming, is what happens next. You will begin Hogwarts in 2 years. In the meantime, your safety is a genuine concern. Voldemort may be gone, the room did not flinch at the name, which Harry noted Dumbledore also noticed, but his followers are not, and some of them are very interested in your whereabouts. "I'm aware," Harry said. "The Parkinson family has impeccable wards, certainly. And I have the highest respect for Isolde's capabilities." A nod at Isolde, gracious and sincere in the way of someone paying a genuine compliment for political purposes. "But the blood ward protection your mother created it is very specific, very powerful, and I don't want you to lose it prematurely if it can be avoided." "My mother is dead," Harry said. "The protection lives in her sacrifice, not in whether I'm sleeping in a particular postcode." He watched Dumbledore's expression. "Or is there something about the specific magical mechanics that requires my physical presence at Privet Drive? Because if so, I'd like to understand it." Dumbledore looked at him with the expression of a man who was trying to decide how much this child actually knew and was increasingly unable to determine an upper limit. "It is," he paused, "a complex piece of magic. I've been reading about sacrifice-based protective wards. The Parkinson Library has several good sources." Harry kept his voice academic. "The protection keys to blood, not location, doesn't it? The location element is a secondary anchor, it strengthens the ward but isn't load-bearing. The primary condition is that I'm alive and that I acknowledge her sacrifice, which I do." He looked at Dumbledore calmly. "So the ward still functions. It's just not maximally efficient." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in conversation was a significant silence. "You have," Dumbledore said, "been reading very thoroughly." "I had reasons to," Harry said. The blue eyes studied him for a long moment, and Harry looked back without performance, without defiance, without any attempt to seem more or less than he was. He was simply himself, sitting in a chair in a room in a house that had already decided what he was, and he had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and Dumbledore was going to have to deal with that. "I think," Dumbledore said slowly, "that I had formed an expectation of who you might be, at 11. Or even at 13. Something genuine moved through his expression. "I confess I had not accounted for this." "For what?" "For a boy who asks the right questions." He almost smiled. "Your mother asked the right questions. Your father asked the wrong questions very loudly, which was a different but equally useful skill." He looked at Harry with something that was more honest than anything he'd offered yet. "I came here to ask you to go back to Privet Drive, Harry. Or at the very least to limit your public presence until you begin Hogwarts. I thought I was coming to have a conversation with a traumatized child who needed guidance. And instead?" Harry said. "And instead I find myself in a conversation with someone who has already read the primary sources." He paused. "It rather changes my approach." Isolde made a small sound that was not quite amusement and was not quite "I told you." Dumbledore sat back in his chair. He looked tired for a moment, genuinely tired, the tiredness of someone managing an enormous number of things simultaneously, and Harry felt something that wasn't sympathy exactly but was adjacent to it. Dumbledore was not a villain. That was important to understand. He was a man running a strategy for a war that had paused but not ended, and the strategy required certain pieces to be in certain places, and Harry was a significant piece that was no longer where it was supposed to be. That didn't make the strategy right. But it made Dumbledore human. I'm not going back to Privet Drive, Harry said. I understand why you placed me there and I understand the magical logic, and I'm telling you clearly that I'm not going back. He paused. I'm going to attend Hogwarts in 2 years. I'm going to learn magic properly in the meantime, here, with qualified tutors. I'm open to staying in contact. To being briefed on genuine threats, because I'm not an idiot and I know Voldemort isn't permanently gone. He held the old wizard's gaze. But I'm not going to be managed. I'll work with you on things that matter. I won't be directed on things that are about controlling what I know or who I am. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is a remarkably considered position for someone who is 7 years old. I've had a lot of time to think, Harry said. Another silence. And then Dumbledore did something Harry hadn't expected, he laughed. Not the warm, performance laugh from the beginning of the meeting, but a genuine one, brief and surprised, the laugh of a man who had just had something genuinely unexpected happen to him. Very well, he said. I suspect, his eyes did something complicated, that this is not the last difficult conversation we will have. Probably not, Harry agreed. I would ask one thing, Dumbledore said. As a genuine request, not a direction. He met Harry's eyes. Be careful with what you know and how visibly you know it. There are people who would be frightened by you. Frightened people make poor decisions. Harry thought about Uncle Vernon's face. About the particular quality of fear that expressed itself as cruelty. I'm aware of that, he said. Good. Dumbledore stood, the meeting was over and he was choosing when it ended, which Harry allowed because it cost him nothing to allow it. The old wizard shook Isolde's hand with genuine warmth and said several things to her that were both polite and meaningful in ways Harry wasn't yet fluent enough in the social language to fully parse. Then he turned to Harry. He didn't shake his hand. He looked at him, those famous blue eyes doing something that was assessment and grief and genuine affection all at once, affection for something other than Harry specifically, affection for his mother, Harry thought, and possibly his father, and possibly the version of this story where he'd had more control. Take care of yourself, Harry, he said. You are, considerably more important than you know. I'm beginning to understand what I am, Harry said. I appreciate you coming. Dumbledore left. The room reorganized itself without him in it. Pansy came away from the window. She sat down in Dumbledore's vacated chair and looked at Harry with the expression that meant she was assembling an analysis. Well, she said. He's not going to give up, Harry said. He'll respect the boundary I drew. For now. But he has a plan and I'm central to it and he won't stop working toward it. No, she agreed. But he's also not going to fight you directly. He knows when something has moved. She paused. And he told you something useful. Which part? That people will be frightened of you. She looked at him steadily. He wasn't warning you to hide it. He was warning you that frightened people will come after you. He thinks that's a reason for caution. She paused. What do you think it is? He thought about it honestly. A reason to be ready, he said. She nodded, once. Gringotts tomorrow, then? He'd already decided. Gringotts tomorrow. He wore the ring out of the vault on a Wednesday morning with the sun coming in sideways across the alley and the London streets going about their business. It settled onto his finger like it had been sized for him specifically, which he supposed it had been, in whatever sense ancient magical objects were sized for their inheritors. The silver was cool for a moment and then matched his temperature exactly. Nothing dramatic happened. No light, no sound, no visible transformation. But something shifted in the fabric of whatever magical world he existed in, the same way a lock click shifted the state of a door. Something registered. Something acknowledged. He walked out of Gringotts with Pansy at his side and the ring on his finger, and nobody in Diagon Alley knew yet, and that was fine. They would eventually. Things were moving now in the way of things that had found their proper direction, not quickly but with the inevitability of water following the right channel. 2 years passed in the way of years that were full. They were not simple years. Nothing was simple in a household where 3 people with significant magical ability and overlapping political concerns were navigating a child's emergence into his full inheritance while simultaneously managing ministry inquiries, Dumbledore's polite and persistent correspondence, and the normal chaos of 2 children learning serious magic from a curriculum that Isolde had described as approximately Hogwarts Year 1 through 4, compressed and supplemented. But they were good years, in the way of years that had purpose and direction and the specific joy of learning things that mattered. Harry learned charms and transfiguration and basic potions and the theory of ancient magic. He read Slytherin's notebooks in the vault during regular visits, learning in large careful pieces, and wrote his annotations and corrections in a leather journal that was beginning to look respectable. He practiced wand work until it was second nature and then practiced until second nature wasn't good enough and then practiced until the gap between thought and magical effect was less a gap than a reflex. By the time his Hogwarts letter arrived, on a bright morning in late July, delivered by a school owl that seemed faintly startled to land in the Parkinson estate's formal receiving room, he was reading at what Whitmore described as newt-adjacent levels in magical theory, and his practical magic was sufficiently unusual that Whitmore had, at one session, simply sat back and watched and not corrected anything. The letter itself was unremarkable. Standard invitation, supply list, platform instructions. Harry read it and set it on the table. "Ready?" Pansy said. "Yes," he said. The second Diagon Alley visit was different from the first. He was older, taller, the glasses replaced months ago with a simple correction charm that Isolde had applied with the offhand competence of someone treating a routine matter. He moved through the alley with a sureness that the first visit hadn't had, not arrogance, just the quality of someone who knew where they were and why and what they were going to do next. He was recognized 3 times before they reached the bookshop. He handled each instance with pleasant brevity and moved on. He didn't hide the ring. He didn't announce it either. It was simply visible on his right hand, to anyone who knew what it was, and the people who knew what it was had their reactions, and he noted them and kept walking. In Madame Malkin's for the second time, fitting Hogwarts robes, there was another boy being fitted on the next stand. Blonde, pale, with the particular quality of someone who had been raised to expect attention and was genuinely startled when he didn't get it in the precise form he expected. "Hogwarts too?" the boy said, to Harry. "First year? My name's Malfoy. Draco Malfoy." He said the name the way people said names they expected to be recognized. Harry looked at him. He had a sense of Draco Malfoy from Isolde, not her explicit assessment, but the picture assembled from context. Lucius Malfoy's son. Raised with every advantage, including the advantage of knowing exactly what those advantages were. Not stupid. Not cruel by nature. Shaped by a world that told him shape and substance were the same thing. "Harry Potter," he said. Draco's eyes went to his forehead, instinctive, everyone's did, and then to the ring on his right hand, and something moved rapidly through his expression. He knew the ring. He'd been raised in a world where such things were recognized. "That's," he started. "A founder's ring, yes," Harry said pleasantly. Draco stared at him for a moment. "My father said you might be," he stopped himself. Reformed whatever he'd been about to say. "You're going to Hogwarts this year?" "Yes." "Which house do you think you'll be in?" Harry looked at him steadily. "Slytherin," he said. The same tone he used for facts. Draco stared. Then something in his face made a complicated journey and arrived somewhere uncertain. He'd come into this shop expecting, Harry thought, to be the significant person in this interaction, and he was discovering that reality had other plans. "The Malfoy family has always been in Slytherin," Draco said. "More carefully now." "I know," Harry said. "Then we'll probably see a lot of each other." Madame Malkin announced that his fitting was complete, and Harry stepped down and paid and left, and outside Pansy fell into step beside him and said, "Draco Malfoy." "Yes." "How was he?" "Thrown," Harry said. "He'll need time to work out what I am relative to what he expected." He paused. "He's not going to be a problem. He's going to need to decide whether to be useful." She glanced at him. "And if he decides not to be?" "Then he's not useful," Harry said simply. "And that's his loss." The Hogwarts Express on September the 1st smelled like coal smoke and nervous excitement, and approximately 400 children having the best and worst morning of their lives simultaneously. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4 with a trunk full of books, a holly wand, and the specific quality of readiness that came from 2 years of deliberate preparation, and watched the chaos of families and owls and trunks and emotional goodbyes, and felt entirely calm. Isolde had not been effusive at the platform. She'd said, precisely, behave strategically, correspond regularly, don't let anyone make your decisions for you. Then she'd looked at Harry and added, "Your parents would have been," and stopped. She didn't finish it. He didn't need her to. He found a compartment mid-train, empty, and put his trunk up and sat and looked out at the platform. Pansy arrived 2 minutes later, settling opposite him with her own trunk already stowed with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before in her imagination if not in fact. The train moved. England slid past the windows. Harry read for the first hour, then simply watched the landscape change, the south giving way to the Midlands and then the rough green of further north, the sky getting wider and more interesting. Various first years found the compartment at various points. A girl with wild dark hair and quick eyes who introduced herself as Hermione Granger and immediately asked if he was Harry Potter and then immediately started talking about books without waiting for an answer, which he found he didn't mind. A round-faced boy named Neville Longbottom who'd been looking for his toad and whose expression when he found the compartment already occupied had the quality of someone bracing for rejection, which he'd clearly experienced before and which Harry resolved by simply gesturing at the seat and saying, "Sit down, there's room," and watching Neville's entire posture reorganize. Draco Malfoy came at the end, with 2 large boys he introduced as Crabbe and Goyle, and he was doing the version of himself that performed confidence rather than having it, which Harry could now read clearly as a different thing. He said something pointed about knowing which families were worth associating with, and Harry looked at him and said pleasantly, "Draco. There's room if you want to sit. Otherwise we'll see you at the sorting." Draco looked at the compartment, at Harry, at Pansy who was watching him with the precise expression of someone who knew his family well and had already made preliminary assessments, at Hermione who was looking at him with the expression of someone who had read about Slytherin-Gryffindor tensions and was taking notes, at Neville who was holding his toad. He looked at the ring on Harry's right hand. He sat down. His companions stayed outside looking uncertain, which Draco appeared to decide was their problem, and that decision, Harry thought, was actually the most interesting thing he'd done. The castle appeared in the last light of evening across a black lake, and it was, he had expected it to be impressive, but the expectation and the reality were different things. It was ancient and vast, and it was alive in the way that the Parkinson Manor was alive, the way Gringotts was alive, everything that had accumulated centuries of magic developing a quality of presence that was different from simple building. Except this was a magnitude beyond all of that. He could feel it from the boats, the wards, and the enchantments and the deep, geological history of a place where magic had been practiced at serious levels for 1,000 years. And it recognized him. The same way the manor had, the same way the vault door had. Something in the castle's deep, accumulated magic turned and looked, and he felt it as a kind of warmth, a settling. He put his hand on the side of the boat and felt the castle's magic hum briefly against his palm and looked up at the towers against the darkening sky and thought, yes. This too is mine. The sorting was held in the great hall under enchanted candles and 4 long house tables, with the tattered hat on its stool and several hundred existing students watching from their benches. Professor McGonagall led the first years in with the brisk authority of someone who had done this many times and maintained her standards regardless of repetition. Harry stood in the line of first years and waited. Abbott, Hannah, Hufflepuff and the table on the right erupted cheerfully. He watched each sorting with the attention of someone collecting information. The hat took varying amounts of time with each student. Sometimes it was immediate, sometimes it sat on a head for 30 seconds or more, communing privately with whoever was inside it. The great hall was warm and bright, and the staff table at the front held faces he'd read about, Quirrell with his ridiculous turban, McGonagall watching the line with professionally suppressed emotion, the long table scattered with professors he'd encounter formally starting tomorrow. Snape, at the end of the table, with the face of someone who had arranged it long ago to reveal as little as possible, looked at the line of first years with black eyes that moved along the queue and stopped, briefly, when they reached Harry. Something moved through those eyes, fast, complex, not hostile exactly but not warm either. Something that was more like the expression of a man recalculating distances. Granger, Hermione, Gryffindor, to Hermione's visible satisfaction and her immediate scanning of the Gryffindor table for suitable seating. Longbottom, Neville, a long pause, and then Gryffindor, and Neville's relief was visible from across the hall. Malfoy, Draco, the hat didn't even settle before it called Slytherin, and the green and silver table erupted, and Draco walked to it with the bearing of someone going to their rightful inheritance. Parkinson, Pansy, the hat sat on her head for 7 seconds. Harry had counted. Then, Slytherin, and the green table cheered again, and Pansy walked to it without looking back, because she already knew he'd be there. Potter, Harry, the great hall went silent. Not gradually. Immediately. The kind of silence that descended when an entire room simultaneously decided to stop doing anything else. He walked to the stool with his hands in his pockets and sat down, and the hat descended over his eyes, dropping him into the private darkness of the thing, and the voice came immediately, ancient and musty and considerably more aware than it appeared. Interesting, it said. Not the internal voice he'd expected, but something that was genuinely there, genuinely present, reaching into the structure of his mind with the professional interest of something that had been doing this for 1,000 years. Very interesting indeed. I haven't felt anything like this in, well, quite some time. Not since the school was young. Hello, Harry thought back. You know where you belong, the hat said. It wasn't a question. You've always known. The question is whether you want everyone else to know it. I see no reason to hide it, Harry thought. No, the hat agreed, with something like satisfaction. No, I don't suppose you do. A pause. You should know that it won't be simple. What you are, in that house, with those people who think they understand what Slytherin means, I know what it means, Harry thought. I've read the original sources. The hat made a sound that was the closest it could come to a laugh. Yes, you have. All right then, Mr. Potter. Let us give the castle what it's been waiting to hear. The hat's brim opened and it shouted, to the silently waiting hall, Slytherin. The silence lasted a full 2 seconds longer before the Slytherin table erupted, and then the rest of the hall broke apart into noise, not just the Slytherin table cheering but the entire hall reacting, the other 3 tables shifting into excited murmuring, heads turning, the kind of cascading response that meant news was spreading in real time. He could hear his name moving through the hall in a ripple. He stood up from the stool and put the hat back on it with a nod of acknowledgement and walked to the Slytherin table with the same quality of attention he'd used in the robe shop, in Diagon Alley, in the sitting room with Dumbledore. Not performing. Not posturing. Just himself, moving to where he belonged. Pansy was watching him from her seat, and she wasn't cheering with the rest of the table. She was simply looking at him with the expression that meant she was satisfied with how something had gone, the same expression she'd worn when he'd lit the 5 candles, when he'd raised the water, when he'd held Dumbledore's gaze across the formal sitting room. He sat down across from her. From further down the table, Draco Malfoy was looking at him with the expression of someone who had spent the last several hours revising their understanding of the situation and was not yet finished. Around him, the Slytherin first years and a good portion of the upperclassmen were looking at Harry with a range of expressions: assessment, curiosity, the political interest of people who understood what the presence of the boy who lived in Slytherin meant for their house's public standing, and a few faces further back who looked less welcoming and were going to have to work out where to put that feeling. Harry looked back at all of them, calmly, without threat or performance, and let them look. The staff table, he glanced up. McGonagall was wearing the expression of someone whose long-standing assumptions had just been structurally reorganized. The headmaster, Dumbledore, had his hands folded in front of his lips, his eyes on Harry with an expression that was part assessment, part something that Harry thought might have been genuine surprise despite everything. Snape had gone very still and was watching Harry with the precision of a man who had expected many possible outcomes and was working through whether this was on the list. Quirrell was looking at him with an interest that was different from the others in a way Harry filed away immediately, a quality to it that was off-key, wrong in a register he couldn't yet name but that the magic in him noted and kept. The sorting continued around them. The feast appeared. The hall reorganized into the ordinary noise of hundreds of people eating together. And Harry sat in the green and silver of his house and ate and watched and thought, and Pansy passed him the potatoes without being asked because she'd noticed he was looking at them, and somewhere above them the enchanted candles burned on the dark ceiling like a lesser imitation of stars. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And everyone in the room knew it, though most of them wouldn't know what to do with that knowledge for some time yet. That was all right. He wasn't in a hurry. Chapter 5, The Heirs House Slytherin Dungeon Common Room at midnight looked exactly like what it was, a room that had been accumulating the character of its occupants for 1,000 years and had decided it liked the dark. Harry sat in one of the deep chairs by the cold fireplace. He'd lit it, because the dungeon in September was unreasonably cold and he saw no reason to be cold. With one of Slytherin's notebooks open in his lap and a second-year Slytherin named Marcus Flint watching him from across the room with the expression of someone who had not yet decided what to make of the new first year who had lit the fire wandlessly upon entering the common room and then sat down without acknowledging that he'd done anything remarkable. "You're not supposed to be up," Flint said finally. Harry glanced at him. "Neither are you." A pause. Flint looked at the fire, at Harry, at the notebook. "What are you reading?" "Primary source material." Harry turned a page. "Go to bed, Flint." Flint went to bed. Not because he'd been intimidated exactly, but because the economy of Harry's attention made it clear that the conversation was finished, and Flint was practical enough to recognize a closed door. The common room was otherwise empty. Harry read for another hour, working through a section of Slytherin's third notebook that concerned the original intent of the heir inheritance, not political succession but something more specific, a transfer of magical understanding, the capacity to engage with magic at a foundational rather than applied level. He was working out the implications of this when the fire popped and a bat swooped through one of the high dungeon windows and out again, which was apparently normal down here. He went to bed at 1. He slept well. He always slept well now. The next morning established the pattern of Hogwarts with the efficiency of institutions that had been doing the same thing for centuries. Breakfast in the Great Hall, schedules distributed by Professor Sprout acting as Slytherin head of year for administrative purposes, and then the first round of classes beginning at 9. Charms with Professor Flitwick, who was small and enthusiastic and had the quality of someone genuinely in love with his subject matter. He explained the Wingardium Leviosa charm with evident pleasure and set them to practice on their feathers. Harry watched the class. He watched how the charm was taught, the wrist movement, the incantation, the emphasis on the specific gesture as the mechanism for directing intent. He thought about what the charm was actually doing, which was imposing a targeted suspension of gravitational effect through a focused magical expenditure keyed to the object's mass and, the feather lifted off his desk, hovered at exactly the height he decided it should hover, and stayed there without any visible effort. Flitwick, moving between desks, stopped when he reached Harry. He looked at the feather. He looked at Harry. He consulted some internal metric that Harry couldn't see but that seemed to produce a reading he found significant. "Mr. Potter," he said, very quietly, "have you done this charm before?" "No," Harry said. "But I've read the theory." Flitwick stood there for a moment. "Move it from side to side." Harry moved it from side to side. He did it without the wrist movement, because the wrist movement was a tool for directing intent and he didn't need the tool because the intent was sufficiently precise without it. Flitwick made a sound that was barely audible, a small, compressed sound, the sound of someone experiencing something they would need to think about later. "Good," he said, and moved on, and Harry thought, he's going to write to someone about this. He didn't mind. He had nothing to hide. Across the classroom, Hermione Granger had also gotten her feather airborne, on her 4th attempt, which was faster than everyone else in the class except Harry, and she looked over at his feather and then at him with the expression of someone who had found something to investigate. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Useful, he thought. She was going to know everything about everything by Christmas, and that was an asset worth maintaining. Potions was a different classroom and a different quality of attention entirely. The dungeons smelled like they'd been storing complex chemical processes for several centuries, which was accurate. Snape's classroom was cold and meticulous and every surface had the quality of something that required respect to avoid consequences. Snape himself arrived in the way of a man who had made his entrance a statement, moving through the room with the particular quality of someone who was both performer and genuine article simultaneously. He stood at the front of the class and looked at them, and his eyes moved along the rows with the assessment of someone who already knew the results and was simply verifying. They paused on Harry. "Potter," Snape said. "Our new celebrity." The tone was a specific tool, not quite contempt, not quite challenge, something more precise than either. Something that was testing the quality of whatever it found. "Professor Snape," Harry said, pleasantly and without inflection. Snape looked at him for a moment with those black eyes that Harry had been watching since the sorting and that he'd been thinking about for 2 years since he'd first heard the name. He'd read about Snape in Isolde's accounts of the war, not in any formal document but in the careful, oblique way she discussed certain figures when his questions about his parents' world had led to relevant names. Snape was a man with a history that pulled in several directions simultaneously, and Harry had decided, on no information beyond logic, that he was not going to be an enemy unless Snape chose to make him one. "Let's see if our celebrity can match his fame," Snape said. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The class went quiet in the particular way of a class recognizing a trap and being uncertain whether it was watching someone walk into it. Harry knew the answer. He knew the answer the way he knew most things, not because it had been explicitly taught but because he'd read everything available and cross-referenced it against theory and the answer was simply there. But he thought about what the question was actually doing, which was not testing Potion's knowledge. It was testing the quality of his response to being publicly targeted by someone with significantly more institutional power. "Draught of living death," he said. "Asphodel from the Asphodelus genus combined with wormwood infusion creates a sleeping potion of extraordinary power. The asphodel is functionally symbolic as well as chemical. In Victorian flower language, asphodel means my regrets follow you to the grave, and wormwood represents absence." Some early potion scholars argued the emotional resonance of the ingredients contributed to the potion's effect, though modern consensus is that the mechanism is purely chemical. He paused. "Shall I describe the brewing process?" The class had gone very still. Snape looked at him. The black eyes did something complex and rapid, several things simultaneously, recalibrating, filing, deciding. He said nothing for a moment. "Where would you look," he said, with the precise tone of someone selecting their next move carefully, "if I asked you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat," Harry said. "It neutralizes most poisons. The Persians used them medicinally from at least the 10th century, the word comes from the Persian panzer, meaning antidote. In a potions context, bezoars are most useful as emergency countermeasures because they're broad-spectrum. Specific antidotes are more effective for known poisons but a bezoar is better than nothing when you don't know what you're dealing with." Snape was very still. He had the quality of a man who had prepared a particular kind of test and found that the instrument he was applying it to was calibrated differently than expected. "And what?" he said, with the quietness of someone who had decided to find out exactly how far this went. is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane. They're the same plant, Harry said. Aconitum. Also called aconite. All three names are in common use, which is either a testament to how widely distributed the plant is or how many different cultural traditions have independently found reasons to work with it, depending on your perspective. He looked at Snape without challenge or performance, just the level attention of someone who was being honest. I've read extensively. I noticed, Snape said. Dry. Not warm, not hostile, dry in the way of someone who was recalibrating without wanting it to be visible. He turned to address the class. That, he said, is what prepared looks like. Whether the rest of you can aspire to it remains to be seen. He moved on, and the class exhaled. Harry noted that Snape did not, after that, attempt to embarrass him. He tested him, twice more during the double period, with genuinely difficult questions, not first-year material, questions that presupposed significant reading, and Harry answered both times and Snape listened and said nothing complimentary because that wasn't the kind of teacher Snape was, but he also said nothing contemptuous, because whatever he'd expected from Harry Potter, this wasn't it, and Snape was too intelligent to respond to the unexpected by pretending it was ordinary. That afternoon, Defense Against the Dark Arts with Quirrell. Harry sat in the third row and watched Quirrell stutter his way through an introduction to minor defensive jinxes and took careful notes and watched the man the entire time. Something was wrong with Quirrell. It wasn't the turban or the stutter, which Harry thought were both partially performed, not entirely. Quirrell was genuinely nervous, but the specific quality of the nervousness was off. It had a layered character, like someone who was afraid but also being careful about what they were afraid of being seen afraid. And beneath that, the thing Harry's magic kept flagging, the quality he'd noticed at the sorting feast, there was something else in the room when Quirrell was in it. Something that occupied the same space as the man but wasn't the man. He said nothing about this. He wrote his notes and answered questions when called on and watched Quirrell's hands when the man thought no one was looking at his hands. After defense, walking back down toward the dungeons, Pansy fell into step beside him. Quirrell, he said. I know, she said. I noticed too. Something's riding him, Harry said. Quietly, the hallway too busy for this to carry. I don't know what yet. But it's not comfortable to be near him. The turban, she said. He's never without it. That's not eccentric. That's deliberate. He glanced at her. She was watching the corridor with the neutral expression she wore when she was thinking seriously about something, and he thought for the 100th time that Pansy Parkinson was very good at looking like she wasn't doing anything when she was in fact doing everything. Don't investigate alone, he said. Obviously not, she said. I'm not Gryffindor. He almost smiled. Neither is Hermione Granger, but she'll figure it out eventually and then she'll do something rash about it. Then she's going to need management. Or she's going to be useful, he said. Both things. The first real test of Slytherin dynamics came at dinner on Wednesday, from a direction he'd expected but hadn't determined the timing of. Marcus Flint was 3 years older than Harry and had been, before September the 1st, the de facto dominant personality in Slytherin's first through third years. He was not unintelligent, he was actually reasonably shrewd, but he operated on a simple hierarchy and had spent 2 years building his position in it, and the arrival of a famous, clearly powerful first year who had sat down in the best chair by the fire and told him to go to bed had registered as a challenge to that hierarchy. Harry understood this. He'd expected it. He waited to see how it would express itself. It expressed itself at dinner through a comment, loud enough to carry, made to a companion but aimed, can't imagine what Dumbledore was thinking putting the Potter kid in Slytherin. Probably doesn't know which end of a wand is which. The table near him went quiet in that listening way that tables went quiet when something was about to happen. Harry put down his fork. He looked at Flint with the direct, unhurried attention he gave to things that required his attention. That's an odd thing to say to someone who lit the common room fire from across the room last night without a wand, he said. Conversationally. What charm did you use to light it this morning? Flint's companions made the involuntary sound of people who had not expected the target to respond quite like that. Flint himself did a brief assessment. He was 16, he was bigger, he was older. All of this was true and none of it was relevant in the way he probably wanted it to be, because Harry was looking at him with the calm of someone who had already run the geometry of this situation and found it untroubling. I don't need to prove anything to a first year, Flint said. No, Harry agreed pleasantly. You don't. Neither do I. He picked up his fork. So we can stop, if you like. The table was very quiet. Flint looked at him. Then at the ring on Harry's right hand, which several of the older Slytherins had already identified and quietly informed others about. Then at Pansy, who was watching the interaction with the expression of someone ready to make observations but not interventions, because she knew Harry didn't need interventions. Then back at Harry. You're going to be a pain in my arse, Flint said, but it had lost its edge. It had become, somehow, almost rueful. Probably, Harry said. The food's getting cold. Flint turned back to his dinner. The table exhaled and reorganized, and Harry ate his food and didn't make anything else of it, and that was the end of the Flint situation, because Flint was shrewd enough to know when a hill wasn't worth dying on. Draco Malfoy, several seats down, had watched the whole thing with the expression of someone filing everything into a mental folder labeled important, reassess. The first week of classes established the academic baseline. Harry was ahead in every subject by margins that varied from significant to substantial. He was not the only capable student. Hermione was extraordinary in charms and transfiguration, Draco was genuinely talented in potions, Pansy had a precision in spell work that was less flashy than raw power but consistently effective. But there was a difference between the others and Harry in the way there was a difference between good musicians and musicians who had something the training didn't account for. Something native. McGonagall, in Transfiguration, gave them each a matchstick and asked them to attempt the basic form change to needle. Harry had the needle before she finished the demonstration. He turned it back into a matchstick. He turned it into a needle again. Then, because he was curious, he tried something Whitmore had mentioned in passing, partial transfiguration, changing only the composition of half the matchstick while leaving the other half wood. The result was imperfect. The boundary between the two states was unstable, but it held for 6 seconds before resolving. McGonagall stood at the front of the room and looked at what he'd done with the expression of a woman who had dedicated her life to this subject and who had just seen something that required her to sit with it. She didn't say anything during class. After, as the students were leaving, she said, "Mr. Potter. Stay a moment." He stayed. Pansy waited in the corridor, which McGonagall clearly knew and clearly decided not to make an issue of. The partial transfiguration, she said. She had the manner of someone being precise about what she was asking. Did anyone teach you that technique? No, he said. I was curious about whether the spell was object level or compositional, and I tried to find the boundary. She looked at him steadily. She was a woman, he thought, who had navigated enormous amounts of complex history, the war, students she'd known who had died, the specific difficulty of being a professor in a school run by a man she both respected and occasionally disagreed with fundamentally, and who had arrived, through all of that, at a core of straightforward integrity that he found very easy to respect. Partial transfiguration, she said, is a theoretical technique that most of my Newt-level students struggle with and that my best students occasionally achieve, after 5 years of practice. She paused. You're 11. 10, he said. I'm not 11 until July. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she said, I will be adjusting your work to reflect your actual level. I will also be consulting with your other professors. You should know that. I expected that, he said. Thank you for telling me directly. She looked at him again with that steady, assessing regard. You're very like your mother, she said. It had the quality of something remembered. She had the same quality of precision. A pause. She would have been very proud. He held her gaze. I hope so, he said quietly. The third week, Defense Against the Dark Arts. Quirrell had assigned them a section of the textbook on minor defensive charms and was shuffling through the front of the room with the nervous energy that Harry was increasingly certain was not entirely authentic when the class was interrupted by the door opening and Snape entering. The room temperature dropped 2 degrees, which was mostly atmospheric. Snape looked at Quirrell with the expression of a man who had a low opinion and was maintaining it through professional courtesy. Quirrell. I need to borrow 2 students for a potions demonstration, you can spare them for 20 minutes. His eyes moved to Harry and, apparently as an afterthought, to Pansy. Potter. Parkinson. In the corridor, alone, Snape turned to them and said without preamble, You've both noticed. It wasn't a question. Harry looked at him. Yes. What have you noticed, specifically? Something inhabiting the same space as Quirrell. I can feel it when I'm in the room. It's not comfortable and it has its own quality, separate from his. Harry paused. The turban. Snape's black eyes were doing something that was not quite recognition but was in that vicinity. And you've done nothing about this information. I'm 10, Harry said. I'm gathering data. Snape looked at him for a moment. Then he said, with the specific kind of dryness that was his version of something warmer, an uncommonly sensible position for a Gryffindor to, he stopped. I'm not a Gryffindor, Harry said. No, Snape said. You're not. Something moved through his expression, Harry couldn't fully read it, it had too many layers, and he said, You will tell me if anything escalates. Directly, not through channels. Why? Harry said. Not combatively. Genuinely. Snape looked at him with those black eyes that Harry had decided were the most honest part of him, the part that couldn't be controlled into neutrality quite as completely as the rest. Because whatever that is in Quirrell's classroom has an interest in you specifically. And because, he stopped. Your mother, he said. Very quietly. She would have wanted someone watching your back. Harry looked at him. Snape looked back, with the quality of a man who had said something he'd been carrying for a long time and was now dealing with the fact that it was outside his chest. All right, Harry said. He meant it. And he thought, from the brief change in Snape's expression, something small and quickly controlled, that Snape could tell. They went back to the defense classroom without a potions demonstration having occurred, which Quirrell apparently didn't question, which told Harry something useful about how much cognitive room Quirrell had for processing the ordinary details of the day. October brought Quidditch tryouts, which Harry attended not because anyone had particularly told him to but because Flint was captain and had been making sounds about first years not being eligible and Harry had looked up the relevant rule. First years couldn't play in proper matches, but there was no rule about tryouts, and he was curious, and showed up and watched the tryouts with the observational interest he brought to most things. He didn't try out for the team. He wasn't interested in being on the team. He stood at the edge of the pitch and watched how people flew, and at the end when Flint was debriefing the tryouts Harry walked out to where a spare school broom had been left and mounted it and flew 1 lap of the pitch at a speed that made several of the Slytherin players stop and watch and made Flint, specifically, turn to look with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd been playing a shorter game than was available. You're not on the team, Flint said when Harry landed. I know, Harry said. I was curious how it felt. He handed the broom back. You should try switching your chaser formation in the third quarter, you're predictable from that position. He walked off. Behind him, he heard Flint say something to a teammate that he couldn't quite catch, and the teammate say something back that had the quality of a laugh of a specific kind, the kind that meant someone had just been impressed against their will and was deciding to reframe it as something else. The Halloween feast arrived with the specific energy of a Hogwarts event, the Great Hall transformed, the usual academic undertone of the castle replaced with something lighter and more festive. Harry ate well and watched the staff table and thought about the third-floor corridor, which had been forbidden at the start of year address and which he had been thinking about with increasing interest since September. Quirrell had been deteriorating. Not obviously, nothing a casual observer would catch. But the quality of the wrongness in the room when Quirrell was present had gotten stronger over October, a slow increase like pressure building, and Harry thought about the third-floor corridor and about what Dumbledore would put a significant security measure on and about what in the wizarding world was currently significant enough to require keeping in a school. After the feast, in the Slytherin common room, Harry sat with Pansy and with Hermione, who had started appearing in the Slytherin common room for reasons that had initially surprised the common room's occupants but had stopped surprising them when it became clear that Harry simply opened the door and let her in, and that was apparently how that worked now. "The third-floor corridor," Harry said. Pansy set down her book. "Yes. Something's in there that Quirrell, or whatever is in Quirrell, wants. That's the escalation Snape asked me to flag." Hermione looked between them with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she'd already researched from 7 angles. "The Philosopher's Stone," she said. "Nicholas Flamel. I've been reading about Gringotts' security measures, and there was a vault robbery in July. They evacuated it, but the article didn't say what was in it, and when I cross-referenced the vault number against the Flamel family records in the library," Harry looked at her. "It's the Philosopher's Stone," she said. "It's here." He thought about this. He thought about a thing that made you immortal and the being that wanted to come back and the currently possessed professor who was the obvious vector and the school full of children and the old wizard who had a plan that required Harry to be a certain kind of not ready. "Dumbledore knows it's at risk," he said. "The security is deliberate. He wants whoever is after it to try, because he wants to know what they'll do." "That's," Hermione looked troubled. "That's using a very dangerous object as bait in a school." "Yes," Harry said. "It is." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why we're not going to wait and see how his plan unfolds." Pansy said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we have better information than Dumbledore about Quirrell's state, because we're in his classroom 3 times a week and Dumbledore isn't." He looked at both of them. "And I'm thinking that whatever security he's put on the 3rd floor, it's designed to slow down an adult wizard. Not necessarily to stop someone who thinks about the problem differently." "You want to get to the stone before Quirrell does," Hermione said. "I want to understand what we're dealing with," Harry said. "Full reconnaissance. Not heroics." "Harry," Pansy said, with the tone she used when she had something important to say and was going to say it once, "if Voldemort is in Quirrell's head, then he knows I'm here," Harry said. "He's known since September. He's had 2 months to make a move and he hasn't, which means he's either not ready or he's waiting for the stone." He paused. "I'd rather be the one who decides when the confrontation happens than have it happen when he chooses." The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Through the underwater green of the dungeon windows, the lake moved in its slow dark way. "Thursday," Pansy said. "Quirrell has no class Thursday evening. If he's going to make a move, it'll be when the castle is distracted." "How do you know he hasn't already gone?" Hermione asked. "Because the stone is still there," Harry said. "I can feel the 3rd floor from here. There's something up there, something significant. Same quality as the vault. It's still present." Hermione stared at him. "You can feel it from the dungeons?" "I can feel significant magical objects when I'm close enough." He looked at her. "It's a air thing. I'll explain it properly later. For now, Thursday." Thursday came. Harry went to Snape first. He knocked on the office door at 5 in the afternoon, which was outside office hours, which Snape's face made clear he was noting. "Quirrell is going to make his move for the stone tonight," Harry said. Snape looked at him with those black eyes. "Your evidence?" "He's been building pressure for 2 months. The Halloween feast was the first time he had significant access to the Great Hall and he didn't use it, which means he was waiting for something. He's ready now and the castle is settled after the feast chaos." Harry paused. I can feel the stone from the dungeons. If he gets it tonight, Voldemort comes back in a form we can't manage this year." Snape was still for a long moment. "You're telling me this rather than going to the headmaster." "I've also sent a letter to the headmaster," Harry said. "But Dumbledore is in London tonight, and his strategy involves letting this attempt happen, and I don't agree with that strategy." Another long pause. "What do you intend to do?" "Go through the security, remove the stone from the final chamber before Quirrell reaches it, and hand it to you to return to Flamel directly." He looked at Snape steadily. "I can get through whatever's in there. I'd like you there as backup, because I'm 10 and I'm not arrogant about what that means against a fully possessed adult." Snape looked at him. Then he said, with the dryness of a man who had decided something, "You are the most aggravating student I have taught in 20 years. "I'll take that," Harry said. "I did not say you were wrong," Snape said, and stood up. The third floor was exactly as forbidden as advertised and exactly as manageable as Harry had calculated. Fluffy, a three-headed dog that made Hermione make a brief, involuntary sound she would later deny, was neutralized by music in the way of things that had very specific vulnerabilities, which Harry had worked out from Hagrid's reaction to the mention of it at dinner in September. The trapdoor, the devil's snare, the winged keys, the chess set, the potion logic puzzle, each designed for an adult wizard working with particular assumptions, each yielding to someone who approached it from a different angle. Snape dealt with the chess set, which was the one point where raw tactical power was genuinely necessary, playing with a precision that was like watching someone do mathematics at speed. Harry, watching him, thought, of course. He would be. The potion room, Hermione's answer, working it out in the time it took most people to read the problem. Harry looked at her as she finished the logic and she looked back and he thought again, useful. Genuinely useful, in ways that had nothing to do with fame or bloodline. Beyond the potion room was the mirror. Harry stopped in the doorway. The mirror of Eriste stood in the final chamber and Quirrell stood in front of it, and in the air between Quirrell and the mirror was a quality that was different from what Harry had been feeling at class for months. Stronger. More present. More aware. Quirrell turned. In the years that followed, Harry would remember this moment as the one where he understood something important about what he was. Because standing in the doorway of the mirror of Eriste's chamber, facing a possessed man who was backed by the most powerful dark wizard of the century, Harry Potter felt exactly nothing that resembled fear. He felt, instead, a kind of clarity that was very similar to what he felt when the match and the needle problem clicked, when the water arc rose, when the vault door opened. The clarity of something that was simply right, in the way of things that have found their correct configuration. "Harry Potter," Quirrell said. The stutter was gone. The nervous energy was gone. The voice had a different quality now, still Quirrell's voice, but carrying something else in it, the way a vessel carried its contents. "I wondered when you would come. I've been watching you since September," Harry said. He moved into the room without hurrying. "You knew I was there." "Oh, yes." The mouth smiled with Quirrell's features and someone else's intent. "I've been watching you too. More interesting than I expected." A pause, and the presence behind the voice seemed to examine him more directly, and Harry felt it, not like the bond's warmth, not like the manor's welcome, but like something vast and cold and ancient trying to locate the edges of what was in front of it. "You have his blood magic but not his intent." "Interesting. Whose blood magic?" "Salazar's." The name came with weight, with recognition, with something that was almost reverence from a being that had spent its existence claiming Slytherin's legacy. "I spent years trying to establish what I called a right to that name. And here you are. The actual thing." "Yes," Harry said simply. "Give me the stone." "No," Harry said. "It's not here anymore." Quirrell, Voldemort, turned sharply to the mirror. And Harry, while that attention was partially redirected, reached into his pocket and felt the stone, which he'd taken from the mirror 2 minutes ago in the moment he'd looked into it and seen himself handing it to Snape and keeping it safe, and which he'd palmed with the practiced quiet of someone who'd spent 10 years learning to do things without anyone noticing. The presence turned back to him. And this time the examination was different, sharper, with the specific quality of something that had been managed. You looked into the mirror, it said. You took it. Yes. A pause. You're 10 years old. I know. Harry looked at the possessed man in front of him. You're not coming back tonight. The stone is going to Nicholas Flamel. Quirrell is going to receive medical treatment, which he needs, and which you are making difficult for him. He paused. I know you're not gone. I know you'll find another way eventually. But not tonight. Tonight you leave. And if I don't, the presence said, very quietly, choose to leave. Harry felt the magic in him, the same thing that had lit the candles, that had opened the vault, that had made the Sorting Hat almost laugh, turn and focus. Not with anger. Not with heat. With the particular cool precision of a key locating its lock. Then I make you, he said. What happened next was not long. It was not dramatic in the way of battles in stories. There was no sustained exchange of spells, no back and forth, no duel with elegant choreography. Harry simply held the awareness of what was in the room and directed everything in him toward the presence that had wrapped itself around Quirrell's damaged mind, and the stone in his pocket aligned with that direction, and the ancient Slytherin magic, which had a very specific and unambiguous relationship with the question of who had actual authority over the Slytherin name, expressed itself. The presence recoiled. It didn't go willingly. But it was, for the first time in decades, dealing with something that had a cleaner claim to the thing it had built its identity on than it did, and the magic knew the difference, and the presence found the boundary absolute. Quirrell collapsed. Snape was through the doorway the moment it ended, and his assessment of Quirrell was professional and immediate. Harry handed him the stone. He put it directly in Snape's palm without ceremony. Flamel, Harry said. Tonight, Snape said, his voice carrying something that wasn't quite the usual control. He was looking at the stone in his hand with the expression of someone processing a great deal very quickly. Harry looked at Quirrell on the floor. Breathing. Unconscious. The particular quality of wrongness that had characterized the air around him for 2 months was entirely gone. He'll need the hospital wing, Harry said. I'm aware, Snape said. He looked up at Harry and for a moment the professional control was thinner than usual, something behind it that was complicated and not uncomplicated. Are you all right? Yes, Harry said. He meant it. Snape looked at him for another moment with those black eyes that were their most honest when they thought no one was examining them, and then he said, Your mother would have, I know, Harry said quietly. A pause. Go back to your dormitory, Snape said. I'll handle this. Harry went. He found Pansy waiting at the base of the 3rd floor stairs, because she'd said she'd wait there and Pansy did what she said she'd do. She looked at him. Her eyes went over him quickly, the same cataloging look, checking for damage. Done, she said. Done, he said. Quirrell? He'll be all right. The stone's safe. She fell into step beside him. They walked back toward the dungeons, through the quiet late-night corridors, past the moving staircases and the sleeping portraits and the occasional suit of armor shifting on its plinth. Voldemort, she said. Was there. Gone now. Not permanently, he'll find another way. But not tonight. She was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore is going to have thoughts about this. Yes, Harry said. I expect he is. He paused. We'll deal with that when he gets back from London. He's going to say you shouldn't have gone in. He's going to say a lot of things, Harry said. Some of them will be correct. The outcome is good. They reached the portrait hole entrance to the Slytherin common room. Pansy gave the password and it opened, and the green-lit warmth of the room was on the other side, fire-lit, because Harry had lit it 2 months ago and the house had just kept it going. He sat in the deep chair and she sat opposite, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "You knew he was going to be there," she said. "In the chamber. You knew it was him." "I thought so." "Yes. You weren't." She looked at him. The careful, direct look that she'd been giving him since the fence slats, the look that saw what was actually there. "You weren't afraid." "No," he said. She looked at him for another long moment. That's not normal, Harry. Not even for someone who's been trained. Being in a room with Voldemort, I know what I am," he said quietly. "Not all of it yet. But enough." He met her eyes. He spent 30 years convincing people he was inevitable. He's not. He's just powerful. A pause. "So am I." The fire crackled. The dungeon lake moved outside the windows in its slow dark way. "We should sleep," Pansy said. "Dumbledore will be here in the morning." "I know." Neither of them moved for another few minutes. He sat in the chair in his house with the warmth of the fire on his face and thought about an old man in a room with a mirror that showed you what you wanted most, and thought about what he'd seen when he looked into it, not the stone, not a family, not himself as something powerful or famous or safe. He'd seen a library. The Wiltshire library in the early morning, the birds outside, the fire going, the deep chairs. And in the chair across from him, someone reading with a finger marking her place, looking up when he came in. He'd seen the beginning of everything. And then he'd turned from the mirror with the stone in his pocket and faced what had come for him, and he had not been afraid, because you could not be afraid of the future when you were already living in it. Chapter 6, Lord's Work. Dumbledore arrived back from London at 7:30 in the morning. Harry knew this because the castle knew it. The same way the Manor's wards announced arrivals, Hogwarts had a quality of attentiveness to significant movement, and Harry had been sitting awake in the common room since 5 with Slytherin's 4th notebook and a cup of tea that Pansy had made without being asked and set at his elbow without comment. He felt the shift when the headmaster passed through the outer wards, and he set down the notebook and looked at the fire. "He's here," he said. Pansy, who had also been awake and who had at some point in the last hour been joined by Hermione, who had apparently spent the night in an armchair and had the dignity not to make it strange, looked up from her book. Common room or his office? Office first. Snape will have told him already. Harry drank the rest of his tea. Give it 20 minutes. Hermione looked like she had several things to say. She'd been processing since they'd returned last night, working through it systematically the way she worked through everything, and Harry could see her assembling the conclusions with the determined precision of someone who needed to understand things fully before she could be at peace with them. "You took the stone out of the mirror," she said. "While Voldemort was in the room." "Yes." "Before Quirrell knew you had it." "Yes." "You planned that from the moment you came through the door." "From before that," Harry said. "I worked out how the mirror worked in November, when McGonagall mentioned Erased in passing. If you see yourself with the stone rather than using it, the mirror gives it to you. The design logic is that someone who wants to use the stone is dangerous and someone who simply wants to keep it safe isn't." He paused. "So I needed to come in wanting to keep it safe, which I did, so that part wasn't difficult." Hermione stared at him. "You're 10. Everyone keeps saying that," he said. "I know how old I am." She opened her mouth. Closed it. "All right," she said, with the tone of someone deciding to move forward rather than continuing to be astounded, which was one of the things Harry had found he genuinely liked about her. She recalibrated quickly. "What happens now?" "With Dumbledore?" "He'll want to understand what happened and what I know and how I know it," Harry said. He'll present it as concern, which is partly real. He'll also be recalibrating his strategy, because last night didn't go according to his plan." "What was his plan?" Harry thought about it. "To let Quirrell try. To contain it at the final obstacle. To demonstrate to Voldemort that the attempt failed and that he was watching, as a deterrent." He paused. It's not an unreasonable plan, if you don't know how far Voldemort had already gotten, and if you assume the students aren't going through the security themselves. Hermione looked troubled. He was going to let it get that far deliberately. He was managing a larger game, Harry said. He wasn't defending it, the flatness in his voice was accurate rather than heated. That doesn't mean it was the right call. But it's why he made it. The 20 minutes passed. Harry went upstairs, changed, came back down, and the three of them walked up to the headmaster's office together, because Hermione said she was coming and Harry saw no reason to prevent it, and Pansy simply started walking without asking whether she was invited. The stone gargoyle knew who he was now. It stepped aside before he gave the password. The office was warm and full of the accumulated objects of a very long life, instruments that moved and clicked, portraits of past headmasters watching from their frames, Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch preening with the self-satisfaction of something immortal and aware of it. Dumbledore was behind his desk. Snape stood to one side with the controlled expression of someone who had spent the night managing an international magical artifact transfer and a possessed professor's medical crisis and was maintaining composure through professional habit. Dumbledore looked at the four of them as they came in, Harry, Pansy, Hermione, and the space that Draco Malfoy was conspicuously not occupying because Harry hadn't told him about last night, which was its own kind of information, and something moved through his expression that was complex and layered and ultimately landed on something genuine. "Please, sit down," he said. "All of you." They sat. Harry took the chair directly opposite the desk, which he suspected Dumbledore noted as he had the first time. "First," Dumbledore said. "Professor Quirrell has been transferred to St. Mungo's. The presence that had been inhabiting him has been removed, and he is expected to make a full physical recovery, though the psychological consequences will require significant treatment." He paused. "That is largely owing to your intervention, Harry, and the speed with which Professor Snape acted." "I know," Harry said. "How is he?" Something in Dumbledore's expression shifted at the question. He had expected several possible openings to this conversation, Harry thought, and that particular one hadn't been on the list. "Weak," Dumbledore said. "Disoriented. He has very little memory of the past year." A pause. "He will survive. Thanks to you." "Good," Harry said. He meant it. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The Philosopher's Stone has been returned to Nicholas Flamel. He and I have spoken this morning and agreed that it should be destroyed. The risk of it existing, given what happened, is simply too high." "That's the right decision," Harry said. A pause. The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles did their assessment, which Harry was accustomed to now, the quality of scrutiny that wasn't intrusive but was thorough, a wizard of this power simply seeing more of what was in front of him than ordinary people did. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "I owe you an explanation. And an apology." "You don't have to, I do." It was gentle but firm. "I used the stone as a lure. I believed the security was sufficient. I believed that if Voldemort made an attempt, it could be contained and monitored without significant risk to the students." He held Harry's gaze with the particular honesty of someone who had decided to be fully honest and was doing it completely. "I was wrong on at least one of those counts, and possibly on all of them. The security I designed was not built to account for students who understood the logic of each obstacle and could work through it methodically." A pause. "It was not built to account for you. To be fair," Harry said, "you designed it in July. You didn't know about me yet." "No," Dumbledore said. "I didn't. But I knew in October, after our meeting, that you were not what I'd anticipated. And I should have recalibrated the security accordingly, or at minimum had a more direct conversation with you about the stone's presence." His voice was steady but had the quality of a man doing something that cost him. "I chose, instead, to continue the plan. Partly because I believed it was the correct strategic decision. And partly," a pause, because I was not yet ready to admit that a 10-year-old boy might have a clearer read on the situation than I did. The room was very quiet. Fawkes made a soft sound on his perch. "I appreciate you saying that," Harry said. "I mean it," Dumbledore said. "Every word." He looked at Harry with those eyes that carried all the decades of a very long life, the losses and the decisions and the weight of the game he'd been running since before Harry's parents were born. "You are not going to be the kind of person I can protect by keeping in the dark. I understand that now, fully." And I think, something genuine moved through his expression, something that was not political, that I may have been approaching the question of your safety from entirely the wrong direction. Harry thought about this. About what Dumbledore was offering and what it actually meant and what it would cost both of them. He thought about the plan, the larger strategy, the one that required Harry to be a particular kind of instrument, the one he'd been working around since he was 7 years old in a garden. "I'm not going to be a weapon," he said. "Whatever comes next with Voldemort, and I know something comes next, and I know it's significant, I'm going to engage with it as myself, with full information, making my own decisions." He held the old wizard's gaze. "I'll work with you. I've always been willing to work with you. But I need to know what I'm walking into, not just what you decide I should know about it." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The office clocks ticked. Fawkes ruffled his feathers. "There are things," Dumbledore said carefully, "that I believe you are not yet ready to hear. Not because I doubt your capacity, I have entirely stopped doubting your capacity, but because some of what I know about what is coming is genuinely harmful information, and I am not sure that giving it to you now serves you." "Tell me that directly, then," Harry said. "Don't manage it. If there's something you're holding back, tell me there's something you're holding back and why, and I'll decide whether I accept that. Don't just not tell me and let me find out from another source." Something moved through Dumbledore's face that might have been the closest thing Harry had seen to him being genuinely surprised by someone. "That is a remarkably mature request," he said. "I have good advisors," Harry said, and meant it. Pansy, to his left, said nothing. She didn't need to. Dumbledore looked at her. Then at Hermione, who had been sitting very still with the expression of someone recording everything for future review. Then at Snape, who was watching the conversation with the controlled expression of a man who had been managing his own complicated position in this room for 20 years. Something moved through the headmaster's face, a kind of assessment, and then a kind of acceptance. "There will be a conversation," Dumbledore said. "A more complete one. Not today. Today has been difficult enough for everyone involved. But soon, and properly." He looked at Harry. "You have my word on that." "All right," Harry said. "In the meantime," Dumbledore said, and now his tone shifted into something more immediately practical, "there is the matter of last night to address publicly. Quirrell's sudden incapacitation will require an explanation for the students and the staff. The Ministry will have questions about the stone's presence here, which I intend to address before they ask them. And there is the question of what happened in the final chamber, which, beyond the people in this room and Nicholas Flamel, does not need to be widely known." "Agreed," Harry said. "I will tell the staff that Professor Quirrell suffered a severe magical accident related to his defense research, that a student discovered him and called for assistance, and that everything is under control." He paused. "This is technically accurate. And the people in this room can be trusted to understand the value of discretion," Dumbledore said. He glanced at Hermione. "Miss Granger." Hermione straightened. "I understand, Headmaster. I won't say anything. Thank you." He turned to Harry. "There is one more thing I want to address. Directly." He folded his hands on the desk with the deliberateness of someone choosing how to say something. "The magic you used in the final chamber. I'd like to understand it." "The Slytherin inheritance," Harry said. "The heir's magic. It has a specific relationship with the claim to Slytherin's name, it recognizes authentic authority. Whatever presence was in Quirrell had built its entire identity on being Slytherin's heir. The magic is, it knows the difference between the genuine claim and the asserted one. I directed it toward the distinction. Dumbledore looked at the ring on Harry's right hand. The Slytherin ring, which Harry had not worn to their first meeting and which he had worn every day since Gringotts. You've been studying the inheritance extensively. Since I was 7. Yes. The blue eyes looked at the ring with an expression that Harry thought was one of the most genuinely complicated things he'd seen on any face, respect and grief and wonder and something that was almost hope, all present simultaneously. Salazar Slytherin was, he stopped. He was not what history has made him. He was a complicated, brilliant, profoundly difficult man who loved this school and who made choices I would not have made, but whose capabilities were. He stopped again. You've read the notebooks. Yes. Then you know. Yes, Harry said quietly. The silence that followed was companionable in a way that none of their previous silences had been. Something had settled in the room, not resolved, not simple, but settled, the way a complex equation settled when you'd found the right approach, not the answer but the method. Dumbledore said, "You're going to do extraordinary things, Harry." Harry looked at him. "I know," he said. Not arrogance. Not performance. The same flat certainty he'd been carrying since the stream in the Parkinson grounds, since the vault door, since the Sorting Hat's voice. Something that was almost a smile crossed the old wizard's face. "Of course you do," he said. They were dismissed, gently, warmly, with genuine regard, and left the office to the late morning light of the corridor outside, the gargoyle stepping back into place behind them. Hermione exhaled very thoroughly. That was a lot. "Welcome to our world," Pansy said. "I've been in your world since September. You've been adjacent to it. That was your first properly significant conversation with the most powerful wizard in Britain." Pansy looked at her with the expression of someone making a fair assessment. "You handled it well." Hermione looked slightly startled by the compliment, which was understandable since Pansy deployed them rarely and without decoration. "Thank you," she said. They walked. The castle was waking up around them, the Saturday morning energy of a school without classes, students in the corridors, the smell of breakfast still carrying from the great hall. Harry moved through it all with the particular quality of someone who was here, fully here, not processing or transitioning but simply present in the morning of his own life. Neville intercepted them near the staircase to the ground floor. He had his toad, it had escaped again, apparently, which was becoming a pattern, and the expression of someone who had been tracking a specific piece of information all morning and was finally in a position to deliver it. "Harry," he said. There's something happening in the Slytherin common room. Flint organized something and he looked faintly uncomfortable. It's for you. I think." Harry looked at him. "What kind of something?" "The whole house is there," Neville said. "Even the 7th years." He glanced at Pansy. She shrugged with the expression of someone who had not organized this and was curious about it. The Slytherin common room was, as Neville had said, the whole house. All 7 years, packed into the greenlit space with a quality of organized waiting that suggested someone, Flint, presumably, had done some coordinating. The fire was going. The dungeon windows showed the morning lake. When Harry came through the door, the room went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when he walked into a space now, the kind of quiet that was attention rather than cessation. Flint was standing by the fireplace. He had the bearing of someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted to do and had committed to it. He looked at Harry and said, without preamble, "Last night, something happened on the 3rd floor. I don't know all of it and I'm not asking. What I do know is that it involved this house and what this house has standing here." He nodded at Harry. "Slytherin has had a reputation for a long time. Most of it's accurate, some of it's not, but the part that's always been true is that we look after our own." He paused. "And we know what matters." We know who has actual standing and who's just talking about it. He looked at Harry directly. I'm not making a speech. I'm just saying the house knows what it's looking at. The room was very quiet. Harry looked at Flint. He thought about the boy who had made a pointed comment at dinner 2 months ago and who was now standing in front of his entire house making a statement of loyalty without being asked and without apparent discomfort at doing it. He thought about what it had cost Flint to organize this, the political capital, the uncertainty about how it would land, the genuine risk of offering respect to someone who could decline it. "Thank you," Harry said. He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without performance, but with the weight of something genuine underneath it. "I'm not interested in what Slytherin used to mean. I'm interested in what it can mean." He looked at the room, the faces watching him, the range of them, the skeptical ones and the already convinced ones and the carefully blank ones who were waiting. Slytherin is cunning, and ambition, and self-preservation, and loyalty to the people who have earned it. Those aren't dark things. They're survival things. They're intelligent things. He paused. "I don't need you to follow me. But if you're in this house, you're in my house, and I'll act accordingly." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back, a fifth year whose name he didn't know yet, started clapping, and it spread, not explosively but steadily, the kind of applause that meant something rather than the kind that was reflexive. He stood in the center of it and let it be what it was and didn't make it into something larger. Draco Malfoy was near the back of the room. Harry had noticed him the moment he came in. Draco had the specific quality of someone who had been waiting to see what the thing in front of them was before deciding how to respond to it. He'd had that quality since Madame Malkin's. He'd had it all term, sitting further down the table, watching, recalibrating. Harry caught his eye. Draco held the look for a moment. Then he nodded, a small, deliberate nod, the kind that meant something in Slytherin's particular social language. An acknowledgement. A choice. Harry nodded back. After, in the small quiet that followed the common room dispersing back to its Saturday morning, Pansy said, "Draco." "Yes," Harry said. "He's going to be useful." "He's going to be a problem," Harry said, "and then he's going to be useful." "In that order." He paused. "His father will have opinions about last night. Lucius Malfoy is going to have a great many opinions about several things, and they're going to find their way to Draco, and Draco is going to have to decide which version of himself he wants to be." Pansy looked at him. "You're not worried about it?" "No," Harry said. "Draco makes his own choices. I've made it clear what there is to choose. The rest is his." He looked at the fire. "Some people need time to get there. That's fine. I have time." The morning settled into lunch, which settled into a lazy afternoon that the castle seemed to have decided collectively to treat as recovery from the week. Harry spent most of it in the library, because the library was where he went when he needed to think without the thinking being social, and Pansy went to write letters, and Hermione appeared at the next table 30 minutes after he arrived and began researching something with the furious intensity of someone who had been promised a complete explanation and was pre-reading for it. He watched her work for a moment with the particular quiet regard he gave things he found genuinely good. "Hermione," he said. She looked up. "What you did last night. The potion logic, you had it in 3 minutes. I clocked it." She looked faintly startled, as she always did when something she'd done was named directly. "It wasn't, it was just logic. Most people's brains don't work like yours," he said simply. "I want you to know I noticed." She looked at him across the library table with the expression of someone who had spent a year being the person who knew the answers and was frequently resented for it and who had not yet recalibrated to a world where that was simply respected. "Thank you," she said. Quietly, and with more weight in it than the words. He went back to his book. Snape found him in the library at 4. He sat down across from Harry without the usual architectural quality of Snape taking a space, which was how Harry knew something was different about this particular arrival. He set a small object on the table, a sealed letter. From Nicholas Flamel, Snape said. He asked me to give it to you personally. Harry looked at the letter. The seal was old, unfamiliar, but with the quality of something that had been in use for a very long time. He broke it and read. The letter was short. Flamel's handwriting was spidery and precise, the writing of someone who had been practicing it longer than most languages had been in continuous use. He thanked Harry with the directness of a very old person who had decided brevity was more respectful than elaboration. He said that the stone was gone, that he and Perenelle had lived long enough and were at peace with it, and that the fact of their deaths, when they came, would be considerably more comfortable knowing that it had ended this way rather than being used for what it was nearly used for. In the last paragraph he wrote, I knew Salazar, very briefly, when we were both considerably younger than I have since become. He was exactly the kind of man who would choose an heir by finding someone who made the water rise on the first try and didn't think to mention it for 20 minutes. I imagine you will do him a great deal more credit than the people who have been claiming his name in the centuries since. Take care of his house, Mr. Potter. It was always worth more than its reputation. Harry folded the letter. He looked at the table for a moment. Snape was watching him with the expression he wore when he was permitting himself to be somewhat present in the room rather than maintaining full professional distance, which was rare and which Harry had learned to treat as significant. He knew Slytherin, Harry said. Apparently. He was 600 years old. 665, Snape said. Harry set the letter down. How are you? He said. Snape looked at him with the particular black-eyed expression of someone who had not expected that question from this direction. He stopped. Functional, he said, which was Snape's version of a detailed emotional report. You did good work last night, Harry said. The chess set. The transfer to Flamel. All of it. Snape was quiet for a moment. You didn't need me, he said. It wasn't complaint or false modesty. It was observation. I needed you for the chess set, Harry said. And I needed you there because I'm 10 and I was right to account for that. He paused. And I needed someone in that room who would make sure Quirrell got treated rather than just managed. You made sure of that. Snape looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man doing a careful accounting of something. Your father, he said, and stopped. Your father and I were not compatible people. I want you to know that I'm aware that my history is complicated and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I know your history is complicated, Harry said. I know you loved my mother and I know how that ended and I know what you've been doing since. He held Snape's gaze. I'm not my father and I'm not my mother. I'm not a way to pay a debt or make a peace with something in the past. I'm just, he paused, someone who could use a potions teacher who actually teaches rather than just demonstrates. Snape's expression did something extremely brief and extremely controlled that was nonetheless visible. You consider my teaching inadequate? I consider your teaching excellent for most students and slightly too careful around me, Harry said. You've been working out what I know rather than just telling me what you know. I'd prefer you just told me. A pause. Then Snape said, with the precise dryness of someone who had made a decision, you will come to office hours on Wednesday afternoons. We will dispense with the standard curriculum and work on what is actually useful. What do you consider actually useful? Advanced ingredient theory. Potion modification. The reason half the formulations in your textbook are wrong. He stood. Bring your notes. I don't have notes yet. I've only been here 3 months. Then bring your questions, Snape said. I expect there are many. He left. Harry watched him go with the expression of someone who had just found out that a calculation they'd been running had produced the result they'd hoped for. Pansy appeared at the library entrance 20 minutes later and looked at him across the room with the expression of someone who had also had a productive afternoon. She was carrying a letter. My mother, she said, sitting across from him. She's spoken to the Wisengamot liaison about the Dursley situation. The formal hearing is set for March. The Dursleys have retained a Muggle solicitor, which is going to be, she looked briefly amused, interesting, given that the documentation she's filed includes 2 different types of magical evidence that a Muggle court won't know how to process. What happens to them? Harry said. The Muggle child welfare system gets involved as well, she filed with them too. Vernon Dursley will lose his security clearance, which matters because of his job. Petunia Dursley will be under a monitoring agreement. She paused. They lose all claim to you legally. Both systems, simultaneously. By April it's done. He thought about the garden. The fence slats. The glass of water. Good, he said. She set the letter down and looked at him. It was the look she'd given him through the fence on the first day, cataloging, assessing, but more open now than it had been then. The careful directness of the bond matured over 3 years into something with more room in it. You look tired, she said. I'm not tired. You look like someone who isn't tired but has been carrying a lot for the past 20 hours. He looked at her. That's more accurate, he said. She nodded. She opened her own book and settled in her chair across from him, the same way she'd settled in the chair by the Parkinson Library's fireplace 3 years ago, and the library organized itself around the 2 of them in the particular comfortable way of spaces that had become familiar. He read. She read. The afternoon went long and quiet and good. At dinner, the great hall was its usual volume and motion, the house tables doing their evening business, the staff table a row of familiar faces that were more known to him now than they'd been in September. He sat at the Slytherin table and ate and talked to Pansy about the flannel letter and to Draco, who had, with the particular Malfoy quality of making a decision and then making it cleanly, simply started eating near Harry more often, a shift in position that said everything without saying anything, about the defense curriculum and what would happen to it now that Quirrell was gone. They'll need a replacement, Draco said. Someone competent for once. Whoever they find, read the theory yourself, Harry said. Don't rely on the teacher. Draco looked at him. Is that what you do? I read everything, Harry said. The teaching supplements the reading. The reading doesn't supplement the teaching. Draco processed this. My father says Snape should have the defense position. Snape is exactly where he should be, Harry said. Potions is more important than defense and he knows it. Draco looked faintly surprised by the certainty of that, then considered it, then appeared to begin accepting it. This was Draco's process: initial resistance, consideration, recalibration, and Harry had learned to give it room. Neville was at the Gryffindor table across the hall, eating with the comfortable body language of someone who had found his people, and he caught Harry's eye and nodded with a smile that was entirely genuine. Hermione was next to him, reading at the table, which McGonagall had apparently given up on discouraging. Harry raised his chin in acknowledgement and went back to his food. After dinner, before the common room, Harry went somewhere he hadn't been since the morning after his arrival at Hogwarts. He went to the lake. The September cold had deepened since the term began. It was December now, the grounds frost-rimmed in the mornings, the lake dark and heavy. He stood at its edge and looked at the water and thought about the term. About Quirrell's classroom. About Snape's office. About the mirror and the stone and the presence that had been in the room with him and that was now, as he'd promised, not here. Not permanently gone. He was not naive about that. Voldemort was not a problem with a single solution. He was going to come back in some form, in some year, with some other approach, and the game they were playing was a long one, and last night was one move in a series that had decades in it still. He stood at the lake and watched the water and thought, I'm 10 years old. I have 6 years of this school ahead of me. I have the Parkinson Library and the Slytherin Vault and the original notebooks and Snape's Wednesday afternoons and Hermione's cross-referenced research and Pansy's margin notes and Dumbledore's promise of a complete conversation and the flannel letter in my pocket and the holly wand and the ring and the magic that was always present and never going anywhere. He had time. And he had, for the first time in his life, the right conditions to use it. Pansy appeared beside him. She had her cloak on against the cold and her breath misted, and she looked at the lake with the same quality of attention he gave it, the look that said she was simply here rather than wanting anything in particular from the moment. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The future," he said. "Broad topic." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep coming back to the same thing. About what we're building and what it's for." He paused. "When Voldemort comes back properly, and he will, it's not going to be like last night. It's going to be a war. Not a moment in a room with a mirror. A real war, the kind that takes years and costs people." He looked at the water. "I want to be ready for that in a way that means the people around me are also ready. Not just trained. Ready." He paused. "That's what I'm thinking about." She was quiet for a moment. "We have 6 years." "Yes. Then we start now and we don't stop." He looked at her. She was looking at the lake, her face in profile against the winter dark, composed and present and entirely herself, the girl from the fence, the girl who'd handed him a glass of water, the girl who had sat in the chairs across from him in every library he'd been in since. "We started 3 years ago," he said. She looked at him then, and the Parkinson composure was there, and behind it something more open, the thing that the bond had started as and that had become over 3 years a different thing, a genuine thing, something with the same weight as the deep Slytherin magic but warmer. "Yes," she said. "We did." The lake was dark and the castle was lit behind them, and the grounds were cold and still, and ahead of them was 6 more years of Hogwarts and everything that came after, the war that was waiting in its patient way, the decisions that were going to need making, the people who were going to need standing beside. He was 10 years old, and he was standing at the edge of everything. He was not afraid. He had never been afraid of this, not since the garden, not since the vault, not since the mirror. He had learned, in the years between the cupboard and here, that fear was the appropriate response to things you couldn't see clearly, and he could see clearly, and the clarity was enough. He put his hand flat against the surface of the lake, the way he'd put it on the vault door, the way he'd put it on the wall of the manor that first morning, the way he'd learned to touch significant magical things to feel what they were. The lake moved. Not dramatically, a small swell, a gentle recognition, the deep lake water responding the way everything magical responded to him, with the same quality of knowing, of settled acknowledgement. He stood up. "Come on," he said. "It's cold." Pansy straightened and they walked back toward the castle together, the Hogwarts wards folding warm and familiar around both of them the moment they crossed the outer boundary, the castle's magic noting their return with the same settled attentiveness it had offered since September. Behind them the lake settled back to stillness. Above them the stars were very bright over the castle's towers. And in the dungeons of the most magical building in Britain, in the common room of the most misunderstood house in 1,000 years of magical education, a fire was burning that had been burning for 3 years now, tended by no one, needed by no one, simply present in the way of things that had decided their purpose and were not going to stop until that purpose was complete. It would still be burning in the morning. It would be burning for a very long time yet.